Volume 3, Chapter 6 of the Vicar of Wrexhill. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The Vicar of Wrexhill by Francis Milton Trollope. Volume 3, Chapter 6. A Second Visit to the Lime Tree. Rosalind, as she walked slowly back towards the house, repeated to herself in shuddering the fearful words of Henrietta Cartwright, "I am an atheist," and her very soul seemed sick and faint within her. She had sought in some degree the friendship of this unhappy girl, chiefly because it was evident that not even the connection of father and daughter had sufficed to blind her to the hateful hypocrisy and unholy fanaticism of the vicar. Did then hatred and contempt for him lead to the hideous abyss of atheism? She trembled as she asked herself the question, but the weakness lasted not a moment. The simple and true piety of her spirit awoke within her, and with kindly warmth cheered and revived her heart. That the unhappy Henrietta, when revolted by watching the false religion of her father, should have fled from it with such passionate vehemence as to plunge her into the extreme of scepticism, offered no precedent for what would be likely to befall a person who, like her, loathed the dark sin of hypocrisy, but who, unlike her, had learned the benignant truths of religion with no false and frightful commentaries to disfigure them. As she remembered this, as she remembered that probably the only religious lessons ever given to this most unhappy girl were such as her judgment must revolt from, and the sincerity of her nature detest as false and feigned, pity and compassion took place of terror and repugnance, and a timid but most earnest wish that she might herself be the means of sending a ray of divine light to cheer the fearful gloom of poor Henrietta's mind, took possession of her heart. The delightful glow of feeling that seemed to pervade every nerve of Rosalind, as this thought took possession of her, cannot be described. Tears again filled her beautiful eyes, but they were no longer the tears of disappointment and despondency. Yet a dread of incurring the guilt of presumption, by assuming the office of teacher on a theme so awfully important, so sublimely exalted, mixed fear with her hope, and she determined to restrict her efforts wholly to the selection of such books as might tend to enlighten the dark night of that perverted mind, without producing in it the painful confusion of thought which must ever result from a loose and unlogical arrangement of proofs and arguments, however sound or however unquestionable they may individually be. When she met Henrietta in the drawing room, where all the family were assembled before dinner, she was conscious of being so full of thoughts concerning her, that she almost feared to encounter her eyes, lest her own might prematurely disclose her being acquainted with the scene she had gone through. But the moment she heard Henrietta speak, the sound of her voice, so quiet, so cold, so perfectly composed, convinced her that the conversation which she had supposed must have agitated her so dreadfully, had in truth produced no effect on her whatever; and when, taking courage from this, she ventured to speak to and look at her, the civil smile, the unaltered eye, the easy allusion to their walk and their separation, led her almost to doubt her senses as to the identity of the being now before her, and the one to whom she had listened in horror a short half-hour ago. This perplexity was, however, in a great measure relieved by an interpretation suggested by her fancy, and immediately and eagerly received by her as truth. "It was in bitter irony, and shrewdly to test the sincerity of that man's assumed sanctity, that she uttered those terrible words," thought Rosalind; and, inexpressibly relieved by the supposition, she determined to take an early opportunity of confessing to Miss Cartwright her involuntary participation of Mr. Hetherington's tender avowal, and of her own temporary credulity in believing for a moment that what was uttered, either to get rid of him or to prove the little worth of his pretended righteousness, was a serious avowal of her secret sentiments. This opportunity was not long wanting, for, perfectly unconscious that Miss Torrington's motive for hovering near her was to seek a confidential conversation, a species of communication from which she always shrunk, Henrietta, who really liked and admired her more than any person she had ever met with, readily seconded her wish by again wandering into the garden walks, on which the sun had just poured his parting beams, and where the full moon, rising at the same moment to take her turn of rule, shone with a splendour increasing every moment, and rendering the night more than a rival in beauty to the day. "Let us go to the same seat we occupied this morning," said Rosalind. "No, no, go anywhere else, and I shall like it better. Let us go where we can see the moon rise, and watch her till she reaches her highest noon. Of all the toys of creation, it is the prettiest." "Shall you be afraid to go as far as the lime tree?" asked Rosalind. "What? The tree of trees? The bower of paradise? In short, the tree that you and I have once before visited together?" "The same. There is no point from whence the rising moon is seen to such advantage." "Come along then. Let us each put on the armour of a good shawl, and steal away from this superlatively dull party by the hall door." The two girls walked on together, arm in arm, both clad in white, both raising a fair young face to the clear heavens, both rejoicing in the sweet breath of evening, heavy with dew-distilling odours. Yet, thus alike, the wide earth is not ample enough to serve as a type whereby to measure the distance that severed them. The adoration, the joy, the hope of Rosalind, as her thoughts rose from nature up to nature's God, beamed from her full eye. Thankfulness and love swelled her young heart, and every thought and every feeling was a hymn of praise. Henrietta, as she walked beside her, though sharing nature's banquet so lavishly prepared for every sense, like a thankless guest, bestowed no thought upon the hand that gave it. Cold, dark, and comfortless was the spirit within her. She saw that all was beautiful, but remembered not that all was good, and the thankless heart heaved with no throb of worship to the eternal Creator who made the lovely world, and then made her to use it. Notwithstanding the interpretation which Rosalind had put upon the words spoken by Henrietta in the morning, and the consolation she had drawn from it, it was not without considerable agitation that she anticipated the conversation she was meditating. If she were mistaken, if beneath that pure sky, from whence the eye of heaven seemed to look down upon them, she were again to hear the same terrific words, how should she answer them? How should she find breath and strength and thought and language to speak on such a theme? She trembled at her own temerity as this fear pressed upon her, and inwardly prayed, in most true and sweet humility, for forgiveness for her presumptuous sin. A prayer so offered never fails of leaving in the breast it springs from a cheering glow, that seems like an assurance of its being heard. Like that science-taught air which blazes as it exhales itself, prayer, simple, sincere, unostentatious prayer, sheds light and warmth upon the soul that breathes it, even by the act of breathing. They had, however, reached the seat beneath the lime tree before Rosalind found courage to begin, and then she said, as they seated themselves beneath the spreading canopy, "Miss Cartwright, I have a confession to make to you." "To me? Pray, what is it? To judge by the place you have chosen for your confessional, it should be something rather solemn and majestical." "Do you remember that I left you in the shrubbery seat this morning fast asleep?" "Oh, perfectly." "You mean, then, to confess that the doing so was unwatchful and unfriendly; and indeed I think it was." "How did you know but I might be awakened by some venomous reptile that should come to sting me?" "Believe me, I thought the place secure from interruption of every kind, but I had reason to think afterwards that it did not prove so." "What do you mean, Miss Torrington?" replied Henrietta in an accent of some asperity. "I presume you did not creep away for the purpose of spying at me from a distance?" "Oh no! You cannot, I am sure, suspect me of wishing to spy at you at all. And yet things have so fallen out, that when I tell you all you must suspect me of it, unless you believe me, as I trust you do, incapable of such an action." "Pray do not speak in riddles," said Henrietta impatiently. "What is it you have got to confess to me? Tell me at once, Miss Torrington." "You really do not encourage me to be very frank with you, for you seem angry already. But the truth is, Miss Cartwright, that I did most unintentionally overhear your conversation with Mr. Hetherington." "The whole of it? Did you hear the whole of it, Rosalind?" "Not quite. The gentleman appeared to be in the midst of his declaration, when my unwilling ears became his confidants." "And then you listened to the end?" "I did." A death-like silence followed this avowal, which was at last broken by Henrietta, who said in a low whisper, "Then, at last, you know me." "Oh, do not say so! Do not say that the fearful words that I heard were spoken in earnest! Do not say that! I cannot bear to hear it." "Poor girl! Poor Rosalind!" said Henrietta in a voice of the deepest melancholy. "I have always wished to spare you this. I have always wished to spare myself the pain of reading abhorrence in the eyes of one that I do believe I could have loved, had not my heart been dead." "But if you feel thus, Henrietta, if indeed you know that such words as I heard you utter must raise abhorrence, it is because that you yourself must hate them. I know you are unhappy. I know that your nature scorns the faults that are but too conspicuous in your father. But is it not beneath a mind of such power as yours to think there is no God in heaven, because one weak and wicked man has worshipped him amiss?" "He worship! Trust me, Rosalind. Had I been the child of a Persian, and seen him in spirit and in truth, worshipping the broad sun as it looked down from heaven upon earth, making its fragrant dews rise up to him in incense, I should not have been the wretched thing I am, for I should have worshipped too." "Henrietta! If to behold the Maker of the universe, and the Redeemer whom he sent to teach his law, If to see worship offered to their eternal throne could teach you to worship too, then look around you. Look at the poor in heart, the humble, pious Christians, who, instead of uttering the horrible doom of eternal damnation upon their fellow men, live and die in the delightful hope that all shall one day meet in the presence of their God and Father, chastised, purified, and pleading to his everlasting mercy, with the promised aid of his begotten Son for pardon and for peace. Look out for this, Henrietta, and you will find it. Find it, and your heart will be softened, and you will share the healing balm that makes all the sorrow and suffering of this life seem but as the too close fitting of a heavy garment that galls but for an hour. Dear innocent Rosalind, how pure and beautiful your face looks in the bright moonlight! But alas! I know that very sinful faces may look just as fair. There is no truth to rest on. In the whole wide world, Rosalind, there is not honesty enough whereon to set a foot, that one may look around and believe, at least, that what one sees, one sees. But this is a perfection of holiness, a species of palpable and present divinity, that is only granted to mortals in their multiplication tables. Twice two are four, I feel sure of it, but my faith goes no farther. "I cannot talk to you," cried Rosalind in great agitation. "I am not capable of doing justice to this portentous theme, on which hangs the eternal life of all the men that have been, are, and shall be. It is profane in me to speak of it, a child, a worm. Father of mercy, forgive me!" she cried suddenly, dropping upon her knees. Henrietta uttered a cry which almost amounted to a shriek. "I had almost listened to you!" she exclaimed. "I had almost believed that your voice was the voice of truth. But now you put yourself in that hateful posture, and what can I think of you, but that you are all alike, all juggling, all. The best of ye juggle yourselves, the worst do as we saw Mr. Cartwright do. On that very spot, Rosalind, beneath the shelter of that very tree, did he not too knuckle down? And for what? To lure and cajole a free and innocent spirit to be as false and foul as himself. Yet this is the best trick of which you can bethink you to teach the sceptical Henrietta that there is a God." "Truth, Henrietta," said Rosalind, rising up and speaking in a tone that indicated more contempt than anger. "Neither truth nor falsehood can be tested by a posture of the body. It is but a childish cavil. The stupendous question, whether this world and all the wonders it contains be the work of chance, or of unlimited power and goodness, conceiving, arranging, and governing the whole, can hardly depend for its solution upon the angle in which the joints are bent. You have read much, Miss Cartwright. Read one little passage more, which I think may have escaped you. Read the short and simple instructions given as to the manner in which prayer should be offered up. Read this passage of some dozen lines, and I think you will allow that in following these instructions, greatly as they have been misconstrued and abused, there is nothing that can justify the vehement indignation which you express." Poor Henrietta shrunk more abashed before this simple word of common sense than she would have done before the revealed word. Rosalind saw this, and pointed out the anomaly to her, simply but strongly. "Does it not show a mind diseased?" she continued. "You feel that you are wrong to make an attitude a matter of importance, and you are ashamed of it; but from the question, whether you shall exist in pure and intellectual beatitude through countless ages, or perish to morrow, you turn with contempt, as too trifling and puerile to merit your attention." "If I do turn from it, Rosalind, if I do think the examination of such a question a puerile occupation, it is in the same spirit that I should decline to share the employment of a child who would set about counting the stars. Such knowledge is too excellent for me. I cannot attain unto it." "Your illustration would be more correct, Henrietta, were you to say that you shut your eyes and would not see the stars, upon the same principle that you declined inquiring into the future hopes of man. It would be quite as reasonable to refuse to look at the stars because you cannot count them, as to close your eyes upon the book of life because it tells of intellectual power beyond your own. But this is all contrary to my resolution, Henrietta, contrary to all my hopes for your future happiness. Do not listen to me. Do not hang a chance dearer than life upon the crude reasonings of an untaught woman. Will you read, Henrietta? If I will find you books and put them in your hands, will you read them, and keep your judgment free and clear from any foregone conclusion that every word that speaks of the existence and providence of God must be a falsehood? Will you promise me this? Let us go home, Rosalind. My head is giddy and my heart is sick. I had hoped never again to fever my aching brain in attempting to sift the truth from all the lies that may and must surround it. I have made my choice deliberately, Rosalind. I have never seen sin and wickedness flourish anywhere so rapidly and so vigorously as where it has been decked in the masquerading trappings of religion. I hate sin, Rosalind, and I have thrown aside for ever the hateful garb in which I have been used to see it clothed. If there be a God, can I stand guilty before his eyes for this? "Oh yes, most guilty. If you have found hypocrisy and sin, turn from it with all the loathing that you will, and be very sure, let it wear the mask it will, that religion is not there. Look then elsewhere for it. Be not frightened by a bugbear, a phantom, from seeking what it is so precious to find. Dearest Henrietta, will you not listen to me? Will you not promise for a while to turn your thoughts from every lighter thing, till you are able to form a surer judgment upon this?" "Dearest! Do you call me dear and dearest, Rosalind? Know you that I have lived in almost abject terror lest you should discover the condition of my mind? I thought you would hate and shun me. Rosalind Torrington, you're a beautiful specimen, and a very rare one. To please you, and to approach you if I could, I would read much, and think and reason more, and try to hope again, as I did once, until I was stretched upon the torturing rack of fear. But there is no time left me." "Do not say that, dear friend," said Rosalind, gently drawing Henrietta's cold and trembling arm within her own. "You are still so young, that time is left for harder studies than any I propose to you." "I am dying, Rosalind. I have told you so before, but you cannot believe me, because I move about and send for no doctor. But I am dying." "And if I could believe it, Henrietta, would that not be the greatest cause of all for this healing study that I want to give you?" "Perhaps so, Rosalind. But my mind, my intellect is weak and wayward. If there be a possibility that I should ever again turn my eyes to seek for light, where I have long believed that all was darkness, it must be even when and where my sickly fancy wills. Here, let the subject drop between us. Perhaps, sweet girl, I dread as much the chance of my perverting you, as you can hope to convert me." Rosalind was uttering a protest against this idle fear, when Henrietta stopped her by again saying, and very earnestly, "Let the subject drop between us. Lay the books you speak of in my room, where I can find them, but let us speak no more." Satisfied, fully satisfied with this permission, Rosalind determined to obey her injunctions scrupulously, and silently pressing her arm in testimony of her acquiescence, they returned to the house without uttering another word. End of chapter 6. Volume 3, Chapter 7 of the Vicar of Wrexhill. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The Vicar of Wrexhill by Francis Milton Trollope. Volume 3, Chapter 7 The Will. It was about this time that Mr. Cartwright, for reasons which will be sufficiently evident in the sequel, set about convincing his wife that there was a very pressing necessity, from motives both temporal and spiritual, that her son Charles should be immediately ordained. There are many ways of convincing a woman and a wife besides beating, and Mr. Cartwright employed them all by turns, till his lady, like a bit of plastic dough, took exactly the impression he chose to give. As evanescent too as it was deep, for he could make her act on Monday in direct opposition to the principles he had laid down on Saturday, yet leave her persuaded all the while that he was the wisest and best, as well as the most enamoured of men. But though living with the wife of his bosom in the most delightful harmony, and opening his heart to her with the most engaging frankness on a thousand little trifling concerns that a less tender husband might never have thought it necessary to mention, Mr. Cartwright nevertheless did not deem it expedient to trouble her with the perusal of his letter to Charles on the subject of his immediate ordination. The especial object of this letter was to obtain a decided refusal to the command it contained, and like most of the Vicar of Wrexhill's plans, it answered completely. Mowbray's reply contained only these words: "Sir, though all my hopes for this life have been blighted through your agency, I will not risk my happiness in that which is to come by impiously taking upon me the office of God's minister, for which I am in no way prepared. Charles Mowbray." As soon as this letter was received, read, and committed to the flames, Mr. Cartwright repaired to the dressing room of his lady, where, as usual, he found her reposing on the sofa, a little table beside her loaded with tracts and other fanatical publications, and in her hand a small bit of very delicate embroidery, which was in time to take the form of a baby's cap. "My sweet love, how have you been since breakfast? Oh, my Clara, how that occupation touches my heart! But take care of your precious health, my angel. My love is now bound up with yours, sweet, 10,000 times more closely than it ever was before, and not mine only, the life of the dear unborn being so inexpressibly dear to us both. Remember this, my lovely wife. Oh, Cartwright, your tender affection makes me the happiest of women. Never, surely, was there a husband who continued so completely a lover. Were my children but one half as sensible of their happiness in having you for a father as I am in calling you my husband, I should have nothing left to wish. Turn your thoughts not that way, my Clara. It is there that it hath pleased Heaven to visit us with very sore affliction. But our duty is to remember his mercies always, and so to meet and wrestle with the difficulties which he hath, for his own glory, permitted the evil one to scatter in our path, that in the end we may overcome them. Then shall we by the heel crush the head of the serpent, and so shall his mercy upon his chosen servants shine out and appear with exceeding splendour and with lasting joy. Heaven prosper your endeavours, my dear Cartwright, to bring the same to good effect. How I wish that Helen would make up her mind at once to marry Mr. Corbold! I am sure that with your remarkably generous feelings, you would not object to giving her immediately a very handsome fortune, if she would comply with our wishes in this respect. Mr. Corbold told me yesterday that he had every reason to believe she was passionately attached to him, but that her brother had made her promise to refuse. This interference of Charles is really unpardonable. I do not scruple to say that in my situation it would be infinitely more agreeable to me if Helen were married. We could give Miss Torrington leave to live with her, dear Cartwright, and I am quite sure the change would be for the happiness of us all. Unquestionably it would, my love. But this unfortunate boy, alas, my Clara, I have just received fresh proof of the rebellious spirit that mocks at all authority, and hates the hand that would use it. I have this morning received such a letter from him, in answer to that in which I expressed my wish that he should adopt a profession and prepare to settle himself in life, as wrung my heart. It shall never blast your eyes, my Clara. I watched it consume and burn, and turn to harmless ashes, before I came to cheer and heal my wounded heart by pressing thee to it. The action answered to the word, and it was from the bosom of her fond husband that Mrs. Cartwright murmured her inquiries as to what her unworthy son had now done to pain the best of fathers. Not only refused, dearest, to adopt the sacred and saving profession we have chosen for him with the most ribald insolence, but addressed me in words of such bitter scorn that not for worlds would I have suffered thy dear eyes to rest upon them. Is it possible? What then, dear Cartwright, will it be best for us to do? It is terrible to leave him to his own wishful desire, and suffer him to enter the army, when we know it will lead him to inevitable perdition. What can we do to save him? It appears to me, my sweet love, that at the present moment it will be most consonant to the will of the Lord to use towards him the most indulgent gentleness. My dearest Cartwright, after such conduct on his part! Oh, you are too good! Sweetest, he is your son. I can never forget that, though I fear that he himself does not too well remember this. If he did, my Clara, he would hardly utter such bitter jestings on what he is so cruel as to call my beggarly dependence on you. This phrase has cut me to the heart's core. I will not deny it, Clara. It has made me feel my position, and shudder at it." Mr. Cartwright here rose from the sofa, and putting his handkerchief to his eyes, walked towards the window. His breast heaved with audible sobs. "My beloved Cartwright, what mean you?" exclaimed his affectionate wife, following him to the window, and gently attempting to withdraw the cambric that concealed his features. "What can that undutiful boy mean? Your dependence upon me? Good Heaven! Is there anything that was ever mine that is not now your own? Alas, dear love, he has not launched a random shot. He knows but too well how to take aim, and how to point his dart, and it has done its work." This was spoken in a tone of such profound sadness that the soul of Mrs. Cartwright was moved by it. She threw her arms around her husband's neck, and fondly kissing him, implored that he would tell her if there were anything she could do to prove her love, and place him in a situation at once to render the repetition of such a hateful phrase impossible. "I thought," she continued, "that your being my husband, dearest Cartwright, gave you a right to all I possess. Is it not so, my love?" "To your income, dearest Clara, during your life, and as you are several years my junior, sweetest. This, as far as my wants and wishes are concerned, is quite enough. But the young man has doubtless found some wily lawyer to inform him that should you die intestate, he would be your heir, as by your late husband's will, my love, though he has left everything to you. Should you not make a will, every shilling of the property will go to him, whatever are the children you have now, or may have hereafter." "Oh, Cartwright! Why did you not tell me this before? Should anything happen to me in the hour of danger that is approaching, think what a dreadful injustice would be done to all. Let me not delay another day. Do send for Mr. Corbold. I cannot rest till all this is set right. My dear unborn babe, as well as its beloved father, may reproach me for this cruel carelessness." "Compose yourself, sweet Clara. I will send for Corbold without delay. But, for heaven's sake, do not agitate your dear spirits. It was the fear of this which has alone prevented me from reminding you of the interest of our dear unborn babe." "And your own, my dear generous husband. Do you doubt, dear Cartwright, that the father's interest is as dear to me as the child's?" A tender caress answered this question. But delay in matters of business was not the besetting sin of Mr. Cartwright, and while the embrace yet lasted, he stretched his arm to the bell. The summons was answered, and the cab dispatched for the lawyer with a celerity that did much credit to the establishment. When Mr. Corbold arrived, he was received by his cousin in the library, which, in conformity to the resolution announced long ago to Charles Mowbray, was preserved religiously for his own use and comfort, and a few minutes' short but pithy conversation sufficed to put the serious attorney au fait of what was expected of him. "You know, cousin Stephen," said the Vicar of Wrexhill, "that the Lord is about to bless my house with increase, and it is partly on this account, and partly for the purpose of making a suitable provision for me in case of her death, which may he long delay." "I am sure, cousin Cartwright, there is no work that I could set about with greater readiness and pleasure. Shall I receive my instructions from you, cousin, at this present time?" And the zealous Mr. Corbold accompanied the question by an action very germane to it, namely, the pulling forth from a long breast pocket a technically arranged portion of draught paper tied round with red tape. "By no means, cousin Stephen," replied the Vicar of Wrexhill. "It is from my beloved wife herself that I wish you to receive your instructions. Of course, what you do to day can only be preparatory to the engrossing it on parchment; and though, from delicacy, I will not be present during your interview with her, yet before the document be finally signed, sealed, and delivered, I shall naturally wish to glance my eye over it. There is no longer, therefore, any occasion to delay. Come with me, cousin Stephen, to my dear wife's dressing room, and may Heaven bless to you and to me the fruits of this day's labour." The master of the house then preceded the serious but admiring attorney through the stately hall, and up the stately staircase, and into the beautiful little apartment where Mrs. Cartwright, with a very pensive expression of countenance, sat ready to receive them. "Oh, Mr. Corbold!" she said kindly, extending her hand to him. "I am very glad to see you, but my joy is dashed with remorse when I remember the thoughtless folly with which I have so long delayed this necessary interview. My dearest Cartwright," she continued, turning to her husband, "can you forgive me for this? Perhaps, dearest, you can, for your soul is all generosity. But I shall never forgive myself. My only excuse rests in my ignorance. I believed that the law gave, as I am sure it ought to do, and as in fact it did in the case of my first marriage, everything that belongs to me to my husband. It is true that I only brought my first husband about £300,000 in money, and most of it has been since very profitably converted into land. Perhaps, Mr. Corbold, it is this which makes the difference." Mr. Corbold assured her that she was perfectly right, not considering himself as called upon at the present moment to allude to the accident of her having children. "Now then, my beloved Clara, I leave you," said Mr. Cartwright. "Not for worlds would I suffer my presence to influence you even by a look, in the disposition of property so entirely your own. This generous delicacy, my beloved husband, is worthy of you. I shall, I own, prefer being left on this occasion with our pious kinsman and friend." The vicar kissed his lady's delicate fingers, and departed. "Heaven has been exceeding gracious to me, Mr. Corbold. It must be seldom, I fear, that in your profession you meet with so high-minded and exemplary a character as that of your cousin. Ah, my dear sir, how can I be thankful enough for so great mercy?" "The Lord hath rewarded his handmaiden," replied the serious attorney. "You have deserved happiness, excellent lady, and you have it." Corbold now again pulled out his draught paper, and with an air of much deference placed himself opposite to Mrs. Cartwright. "I presume you have ink and pens at hand, my honoured lady?" "Take my keys, Mr. Corbold. In that desk you will find everything you want for writing, and in the drawer of it is the copy of my late husband's will. It is this that I mean to make the model of my own. He set me an example of generous confidence, Mr. Corbold, and I cannot, I think, do better than follow it." Mrs. Cartwright drew the desk towards her, and from the drawer of it took the instrument which had made her mistress not only of all the property she had originally brought her husband, but also of an estate which had come to him after his marriage. "This deed, sir," she said, putting the parchment in Mr. Corbold's hands, "will, I hope, supersede the necessity of instructions from me. I am a very poor lawyer, Mr. Corbold, and I think it very probable that were you to write after my dictation, my will might turn out to be something very different from what I wish to make it. But if you take this as your model, it cannot fail to be right, as by this instrument I have been made to stand exactly in the position in which I now wish to place my exemplary husband, Mr. Cartwright." "If such be your wish, dearest lady," said the attorney, "I will, with your permission, take this parchment with me, and by so doing, I shall not only avoid the necessity of troubling you, but, by the blessing of Heaven upon my humble endeavours, I shall be enabled accurately to prepare precisely such a document as it appears to be your wish to sign. In these matters no instruction can make us such plain sailing, my dear madam, as the having a satisfactory precedent in our hands. Ah, dearest lady, when I witness the conjugal happiness of yourself and my ever to be respected cousin, my heart sinks within me, as I remember that equal felicity would be my own, were it not for the cruel interference of one to whom I have never done an injury, and for whom I would willingly show, if he would let me, all a brother's love." "Keep up your spirits, my good cousin," replied the lady. "If Helen favours your suit, and on this point you must be a better judge than I, Charles' opposition will not long avail to impede your union." The lover sighed, raised his eyes to heaven, and probably, not very well knowing what to say, departed without replying a word. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he perceived his cousin standing within the door of his library, which he held ajar. He put out his hand and beckoned him in. "You have made quick work of it, cousin Stephen," said the anxious vicar. "I trust you have not hurried away without fully understanding my dear wife's wishes. I ask no questions, cousin Corbold, and do not, I beseech you, imagine that I wish you to betray any trust. Merely tell me if my dear Mrs. Cartwright appears to be easier in her mind, now that she has disclosed her intentions to you." The best and soberest minded men are sometimes assailed by temptation, of which painful fact Mr. Stephen Corbold at that moment became proof. Some merry devil prompted him to affect the belief that his reverend cousin was in earnest, and putting on a sanctified look of decorum, he replied, "Of course, cousin Cartwright, I know you too well to believe that you would wish to meddle or make with such an instrument as this. When your excellent and I doubt not well-intentioned lady shall be defunct, you will in the course of law be made acquainted with her will. I rejoice to tell you that her mind seems now to be perfectly unburdened and clear from all worldly anxieties whatever." As the attorney ended these words, he raised his eyes, which were fixed as he spoke upon the roll of parchment which he held in his hand, and caught, fixed full upon him, such a broadside of rage from the large and really very expressive eyes of his cousin, that he actually trembled from top to toe, and heartily repenting him of the temerity which led him to hazard so dangerous a jest, he quietly sat down at a table, and spreading open the parchment upon it, added, "But although it would be altogether foreign to your noble nature, cousin Cartwright, to express, or indeed to feel, anything like curiosity on the subject, it will be equally foreign to mine not to open my heart to you with all the frankness that our near kindred demands. Do not then refuse, dear cousin, to share with me the pleasure I feel in knowing that Heaven has taken care of its own. The only instruction I have received from your pious and exemplary wife, cousin Cartwright, was to draw her will exactly to the model of this, which, as you may perceive, is a copy of the one under which she herself was put into the possession of the splendid fortunes of which, by a special providence, you have already the control, and of which, should it please the merciful disposer of all things to order it so that this lady, really fitter for heaven than earth, should be taken to Abraham's bosom before you, you will become the sole owner and possessor, you and your heirs for ever." Mr. Cartwright had in general great command over himself, rarely betraying any feeling which he wished to conceal. Perhaps even the anger which gleamed in his eye a few moments before, and which had now given place to a placidity that would by every serious lady in England have been denominated heavenly, perhaps even this, though it seemed to dart forth involuntarily, was in truth permitted to appear as being a more safe and desirable mode of obtaining his object than the collaring his cousin and saying, "Refuse to let me see that paper, and I murder you." But no object was now to be obtained by permitting his looks to express his feelings, and therefore, though he felt his heart spring within him in a spasm of joy and triumph, he looked as quiet and unmoved as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "It is very well, cousin Stephen," he said. "Make not any unnecessary delay in the preparing of this deed. Life is very uncertain, and moreover the time is known to no man. Wherefore, let this thing be done immediately." "Could I see Miss Helen for a moment alone, if I got this completed, signed, sealed, and delivered by to-morrow night?" said the attorney. "Yes, my good cousin, yes. I pledge you my word for it." In justice to the character of the unfortunate Mrs. Mowbray, it is but fair to remark that notwithstanding the ceaseless process by which from the very first hour of their acquaintance the Vicar of Wrexhill had sought to estrange her from her children, he never ceased to speak of Charles as her undoubted heir, and of Helen and Fanny as young ladies of large fortune. The lamentable infatuation, therefore, which induced her to put everything in his power, went not the length of intending to leave her children destitute, though it led her very sincerely to believe that the power thus weakly given would be properly, and as she would have said, poor woman, religiously, exercised for their advantage. End of chapter 7. Volume 3, Chapter 8 of the Vicar of Wrexhill. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The Vicar of Wrexhill by Francis Milton Trollope. Volume 3, Chapter 8. The Letter Bag. Among the many highly valued comforts and privileges which Mr. Cartwright's exclusive possession of the library afforded him, that of receiving in solitary state and privacy the family letter bag was not the one least valued. It may, I believe, be laid down as a pretty general rule, that those persons who conceive or profess it to be their duty to dive into the hearts and consciences of their fellow creatures, and to regulate the very thoughts and feelings of all the unfortunate people within their reach, are not very scrupulous as to the methods used to obtain that inward knowledge. Mr. Cartwright, according to the usual custom of divines of his class, had his village matron, ostensibly only a merchant of apples, gingerbread, and lollipops, but entrusted with as many secret missions of inquiry as the most jealous pontiff ever committed to a faithful and favoured nuncio on quitting the gate of Rome. She could tell, and was not ill paid for that precious knowledge, how often Betty Jackson went to buy baccy, and how many times in the day Sally Wright looked over her shoulder at the passers-by while walking out with her master's children, and how many pots of porter were carried to one house, and how many times the ladies walked forth from another, besides innumerable other facts and anecdotes, which, though apparently not of sufficient importance to record, were nevertheless of great value to the vicar and his curate, as themes to lecture upon in private and preach upon in public. Sources of information such as these had never been overlooked or neglected by Mr. Cartwright at any period of his ministry, but hitherto he had held them to be important rather to the general welfare of the Christian world than to his own family. No sooner, however, did he find himself placed in the responsible position of master of a large household, than, besides taking the butler into a sort of partnership for the discovery of petty offences, and having moreover an elected stable boy, who made a daily report of all that he saw and heard, and a little more, he determined that all letters addressed to any member of the family should pass through his hand, and in like manner that those put into the letter box in the hall, of which he kept the key himself, should be submitted to the same species of religious examination before they were deposited in the post box. In the execution of this part of his duty, Mr. Cartwright displayed, to himself at least, considerable mechanical skill, for the letters were excellently well re-sealed, and likewise great equanimity of temper; for scanty as the family correspondence proved to be, he chanced to fall upon some few passages which might have shaken the philosophy of a mind less admirably regulated. In former times, if any Mowbray had wished to send a note from the park to the village, a groom or a groom's helper would have taken it; but now, though the establishment was greatly increased, there was no such privilege allowed them, and in order to escape the ceremony of asking permission to employ a servant, they all resorted to the post bag. One of the letters thus sent and thus examined was from little Mary Richards to her friend Fanny, and many more important documents had passed through his hands without exciting an equal degree of emotion. It ran thus: "I cannot express to you, my dearest Fanny, how anxious I feel to open my whole heart to you on a subject that has long occupied us both with, I believe, equal depth and sincerity of interest. I mean, as I am sure you will instantly anticipate, that inward call to especial grace and favour which Mr. Cartwright taught us to expect would be the sure and certain consequence of unbounded faith in himself, for so only can we interpret the language he used to us. If I were to live 1,000 years, dear Fanny, I should never cease to regret the dreadful, but I thank Heaven, brief interval during which I firmly believed that I had received this call. While this frightful and most presumptuous notion had possession of me, I looked upon my dear and excellent mother, ay, and to my bitter sorrow treated her too, as being almost unworthy of communion with me. Is not this of itself enough to prove the unholy tendency of the doctrine? Now that the madness is past, I look back upon it with as much astonishment as sorrow, and can so clearly trace in it the workings of the most paltry vanity and egregious self-love, that while remembering how sincerely I believed myself the better for all the hateful crimes of impious presumption and filial ingratitude of which I was guilty, I cannot but think that the most contemptible follies into which vanity and fine speeches ever plunged a girl in the ordinary routine of this world's nonsense must be considered as innocent and respectable when compared to those committed, oh fearful impiety, in the name of Heaven. Though we frequently meet, I have never yet been able fully and clearly to state to you how completely I have made a recantation of all my religious errors. It is singular how Mr. Cartwright contrives, either by himself or his satellites, to be always hovering near us. For the last 3 Wednesdays I have set off for the park with a firm determination to speak to you on this subject, but I have each time found it impossible. I believe that my countenance or manner much have expressed some part of the anxiety I felt to converse with you, and that my eagerness to obtain my object defeated it. On one occasion, as I think you must remember, Mr. Cartwright himself, though constantly drawn here and there to perform his gracious hospitalities to the rest of the company, ceased not again and again to return with his soft "Well, dear children, what are you talking about?" On another it was his curate and deputy who performed the office of interrupter; and last Wednesday that very unaccountable person, Mr. Jacob, seemed determined that no one should speak to you but himself. I have therefore, dearest Fanny, determined to write to you. I think it likely that I may soon leave this neighbourhood. Major Dalrymple, who has been greatly the means of bringing me back to happiness and common sense, will, I believe, undertake the charge of me for the rest of my life. This, I find, has long been my dear, dear mother's wish. Had I been quite sure of this a year ago, I think I would have been saved this wild interlude of fanatic raving. However, it is over, and greatly as I have been the worse, I hope and believe that for the future I shall be the humbler Christian and the better woman for it. Major Dalrymple is at present in Scotland attending the sick, I believe the dying hours of his cousin Lord Hilton. After his return it is probable we shall leave Wrexhill, and I am therefore most anxious to make you acquainted with my present state of mind, for I cannot but suspect that we have run the farther into this lamentable folly because we ran together. You have already said enough to make me hope that you too are recovering from your delusion, but I cannot be easy without telling you explicitly that I am again the same unpretending little Church of England Christian that I was in the days of our good Mr. Wallace, that I am once more a loving and dutiful daughter to the best of mothers, and ever and always your very affectionate friend, Mary Richards. P.S. Pray let me hear from you. This letter was wormwood to Mr. Cartwright from one end to the other. Had it rehearsed the kissing story, he would have liked it infinitely better. He was quite aware of Mary Richards' falling off, and attributed, as well as that equally evident in Fanny, to jealousy, women's jealousy, and drew thence a species of gratification that almost atoned for their secession, the more so perhaps as the all-important business of the will rendered it absolutely necessary that, cost what converts it might, he should bestow his love-making wholly and solely upon his lady. But to find that this pretty little girl really appeared to have forgotten the kiss altogether, and yet that she had escaped from his net, at the very moment too when, as it seemed, she was on the very verge of becoming a viscountess, was a mortification so cutting that he actually ground his fine teeth together with rage at it. His first impulse was to destroy it, but he recollected that by suffering it to reach Fanny, he should obtain a sight of her answer, and feeling considerable curiosity to discover how he should fare in the hands of the little melancholy poetess, who had of late evidently avoided all tête-à-tête communications with him, he carefully resealed it, and sedulously pinching its folds into unsuspicious-looking flatness, put it aside to be delivered according to its address. The event proved that he was quite right in believing that Fanny Mowbray could answer this letter, but whether the perusal of her reply increased his satisfaction in being master of Cartwright Park may be doubted. Fanny's reply was as follows: "My very dear Mary, I am most thankful to have received your letter, for one source of the mental misery I have endured has arisen from believing that I first led you to fix your attention on Mr. Cartwright, and your faith in the hateful dogma he taught. You are freed, you have escaped, you are restored to the mother you love, and you will be happy. I thank Heaven, Mary, that my heart is not wholly perverted by all the unnatural struggles it has gone through, for I do rejoice, my dear friend, at your felicity with a pureness and freshness of joy that I have never felt at anything since the death of my poor father came and blighted all our joys. Neither am I surprised at the end of your history. May you through life be as happy as I wish you, and you shall have no reason to complain. Of myself I know not how to speak, and yet I am sure that you will not be easy without knowing something of the present state of my mind. Yes, Mary, the mad fanaticism has passed away. but it has left me weak as a child recovered from the delirium of a raging fever, and I feel very doubtful if I shall ever wholly recover it. I am thankful that you have suffered less than I have done. Indeed, the mischief wrought so differently with you, that I almost doubt my power of making you understand all that I have suffered. I cannot explain even to myself what species of feeling it was which took possession of me when first I became acquainted with Mr. Cartwright. Of this, however, I am quite sure, that I believed with all the simplicity of truth and innocence, that all I felt proceeded from the immediate influence of the Deity working within me to secure my eternal salvation. I could not more firmly have believed that Mr. Cartwright was Heaven's appointed agent on earth, and everything he did and everything he said appeared clothed in a sort of holiness in my eyes, which would have rendered it impious to judge him as another would have been judged. During the first 2 or 3 months of our acquaintance, I was happy. Oh, much more than happy. I lived in a sort of ecstasy. I believed myself the chosen of Heaven, and that all the agitating but delightful emotions which Mr. Cartwright's admirations and praises excited were only so many heavenly assurances that I was indeed one of the elected few predestined to eternal and unspeakable happiness. He caressed me. Very often he caressed me. But even now, Mary, that I see clearly much that was then concealed, I cannot comprehend the sort of effect this had upon me. I think that had he asked me to marry him, I should have been conscious of the disparity of his age, and I think, too, that I should have been startled and shocked at discovering that his love, always so fervently expressed, and often shown by tender endearments, was in any way an earthly love. And yet, weak and inconsistent creatures that we are, when I discovered that the object of my mother's last sudden journey to town, in which I accompanied her, when I discovered that her purpose was to marry Mr. Cartwright, the sick faintness that seemed to seize upon my heart and creep over all my limbs, convinced me for a moment that I loved him, not as I fancied I did, dear Mary, as a lower angel might love one of a higher order, but with a love of a weak sinful woman. The tortures I endured that night can never be obliterated from my mind. A terrified conscience and a wounded heart seemed struggling together, as if to try which could torment me most. But the struggle did not last long. My heart, at least all that was tender and womanly in it, appeared to turn to stone, and was tranquil enough as far as any feelings connected with love for Mr. Cartwright were concerned. But religious terrors, frightful, hideous, most maddening, took possession of me. I believed that the crime I had committed in loving the man whom Heaven had ordained to be my spiritual teacher was a deadly sin. I now felt certain, or in the language of the sect, an inward assurance, that I was predoomed to eternal perdition, and that the belief I had once entertained, exactly contrary to this, was of itself a sin never to be atoned, and only to be punished by eternal flames. Is there another torture of the mind equal to this? I do not think it, for true and reasonable remorse for crimes really committed cannot approach it. Not all the sins that man ever laid upon his soul could equal in atrocity what my guilt seemed to me. I suppose I was mad, quite mad, for as I now recall the hours that passed over me, and all the horrid images of the avenging fury of an angry God which entered and rested upon my spirit, I can call the state I was in nothing short of madness. This state lasted, with little variation in the amount of suffering, during the first week after my mother's marriage, and then its feverish violence gave place to sullen, heavy gloom. The cure, however, was near, very near me, for I found it in Mr. Cartwright himself. It was some trifling instance of contemptible artifice which first drew aside the veil from my mental vision, and caused me to see Mr. Cartwright, not as he is, oh no, that has been a work of steady study and some length of time, but as something of a very different species from that which I had fancied he belonged. One must have been under a delusion as complete as mine has been to conceive the sensation produced by once more seeing things as they are. I can compare it only to walking out of a region peopled with phantoms and shadows into a world filled with sober, solid realities. It is the phantom world which produces the strongest effect on the imagination, and the first effect of the change was to make everything around me seem most earthly dull, stale, and unprofitable. I was still, however, a fanatic. I still deemed myself one of those foredoomed to eternal destruction. But one blessed day, some time after I had become convinced that Mr. Cartwright was a very pitiful scoundrel, I chanced to hear him in sweet and solemn accents expound his scheme of Providence to one of our distant neighbours who had come here to pass the morning, and who seemed well disposed to listen to him. I saw that every word he said, rendered soothing and attractive by the gentle kindness of his manner and the eloquent commentary of his eyes, was making its way to the poor lady's soul, just as a year before the selfsame words and looks had worked their way to mine. It was at that moment I felt the first doubts of the truth of the doctrine I had imbibed from him. For himself I had long felt the most profound contempt, but I had hitherto shrunk from the impiety of confounding the doctrine and the teacher. Something artificial and forced in his manner recalled by the force of contrast the voice and look of our dear Mr. Wallace. And then came the bold but blessed thought that the awful dogmas by which he had kept my soul in thrall might be as false and worthless as himself. My recovery from my mental malady may be dated from that hour. Every day that has passed since has led me back nearer and nearer, I hope, to the happy state, of religious feeling at least, in which Mr. Cartwright found me. But the more fully I recover my senses, the more fully I become aware of the sad change he has wrought in everything else. Not only do we all creep like permitted slaves through the house that we once felt to be our own, but he has stolen our mother from us. Poor, poor mamma! How dearly did she love us! How dearly did we love her! Where is the feeling gone? She has never quarrelled with us. With me particularly, she has never expressed herself displeased in any way. And yet her love seems blighted and dried up, as if some poisonous breath had blasted it. And so it has. Placid and fair as is the outward seeming of this hateful man, I question not but every hour brings forth some sorry trick to draw her father from us. Poor, poor mamma! I know this cannot last, and when she finds him out, how dreadful will her feelings be! And then too I have another sorrow, my dear Mary, which tarnishes, though it cannot destroy, the joy of my return to reason. While the fit lasted, I believed it a part of my dark duty to keep Helen and Rosalind and our dear poor exiled Charles as much at a distance from me as possible, and now I hardly dare to hope that this can ever be quite forgotten by them. I have not courage to enter with them into an explanation as full as this which I have now given you, yet till I do this, I cannot hope that they will either understand or forgive me. If Charles were at home, I think the task would be easier, but Rosalind and Helen both seem to avoid me. I believe they are too miserable themselves to look much at me, or they might see that I no longer turn from them as I did some months ago. All this, however, may some day or other come right again. But what is to become of poor Charles? I feel convinced this hypocrite will never rest till he has robbed him of his inheritance, and I sometimes think that as the doing of this must be the act of my mother, it would be right in me to put her on guard against his machinations. But this can only be done by opening her eyes to his real character, and though I think I could do this, I tremble at the misery into which it would plunge her. But this is going beyond your request, dear Mary. You cannot be ignorant that my unhappy mother's marriage has plunged us all in misery, and there is little kindness in impressing this truth upon you when your own bright prospects ought to occupy you with pleasant thoughts of future happiness. Forgive me, and believe me with every wish that this happiness may be as great and as lasting as the nature of human life can permit. Your ever affectionate friend, Fanny Mowbray. Some people might have found the perusal of these letters sufficient to damp the ardour of their curiosity in the pursuit of private information, but it had not this effect upon Mr. Cartwright. He even doubted whether he should not suffer this letter of Fanny's to reach its destination, for the same reason that he had permitted that of her friend to reach hers, namely, the procuring a reply. But upon a re-perusal, for he gave himself the gratification of reading it twice, he tore it into tiny atoms, and then lighted a bogey to set fire to the fragments. The next letter of any importance which fell into his hands by the same means must also be given to the reader, as it contained some important information which, as it immediately shared the same fate as that of Fanny's, remained for a considerable time unknown to the person it most concerned, as well as to all others. This letter was addressed to Helen from one whom beyond all others in the wide world it would best have pleased her to receive any token of remembrance or attention. It came from Colonel Harrington, and contained the following lines: "Were Miss Mowbray placed in other circumstances, were not all proper access to her barred by the hateful influence of an alien and a stranger to her and to her blood, I should not thus venture to address her. All application to your mother and natural guardian would be, we know but too well, in vain. Nay, there is every reason to believe that any application to yourself through her would never be permitted to reach you. But rascal as this Cartwright has proved himself, I presume he does not tamper with the post, and it is therefore by this vulgar and ordinary medium that I determine to make known to you what it is great misery to conceal. Yet, after all, in saying, 'Helen, I love you,' I think I say nothing that you do not know already. But nevertheless it is delightful to say it, and were I, sweet Helen, once more within reach of being heard by you, I might perchance weary you with the repetition of it. But this is not all I have to say. though it is only in the supposition of your listening to this without anger that I dare proceed. I believe, Helen, I ought to say something, a great deal perhaps, about my presumption, and my fears, and I know not what beside. But the simple truth is, that being quite conscious I loved you, and not feeling the least reason or wish to conceal it, my manner and words too, I believe, must have let you into the secret the last time we met, and those dear eyes, with their long eyelashes, so constantly as they are before me, would long ago have looked me into despair if the memory of one soft glance at parting had not permitted me to hope. My father and mother, Helen, know that I love you, and that all my future happiness hangs on your consenting to become my wife, even without your mother's consent. Why should I conceal from you that I know it will be refused? Why should I not frankly and fairly tell you at once, my beloved Helen, that something very like an elopement must be resorted to before you can be mine? But what an elopement! It will only be to the house of your godmother, who already loves you as her child, and who not only sanctions my addressing you, but has commissioned me to say that she shall never know anything approaching happiness till she can take you in her arms and call you her real daughter and her William's wife. For my father, you know his oddities. He declares that if you will come to Oakley and frankly consent to be his daughter, it will be the happiest moment of his life when he puts your hand in mine and calls you so. But he swears lustily, Helen, that no application to your mother shall ever be made with his consent. This is rough wooing, sweet one, but I do not overrate the generosity of your temper when I express my belief that you will not suffer what is inevitable to destroy hopes that smile so sweetly on us. Address your answer to Oakley, Helen. Write it, if you will, to my mother. Dear and precious as one little line of kindness would be to me, I will not ask it if your proud heart would find it easier to open itself to her than to me. But keep me not long in suspense. Before I shall have sealed my letter, I shall feel sick because the answer to it is not come. My regiment is not going abroad. The change in its destination was only known to us on Friday last. Farewell! How wholly does my fate hang upon your answer! Ever, ever yours, William Harrington. The destruction of this letter was attended with a feeling of pleasure greatly superior both in quality and extent to that which he received from watching spark after spark die away from the fading embers of poor Fanny's long epistle. That was merely a matter of mawkish sentiment. This was an affair of business. But Miss Helen shall have a lover, nevertheless. It was thus he ended his cogitation. My cousin Stephen will not fail me. This evening he will be here, with what will make the young lady's hand worth just as much as I please. And no more, and if my worthy cousin likes her, he shall have her. And as he thought these words, a smile curled his lips, and he playfully blackened the paper, and singed it, and finally set it in a blaze, uttering aloud as the flame expired, "A lieutenant colonel of dragoons, versus the Vicar of Wrexhill." End of chapter 8. Volume 3, Chapter 9 of the Vicar of Wrexhill. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The Vicar of Wrexhill, by Francis Milton Trollope. Volume 3, Chapter 9. The Will Executed. The evening was pretty far advanced, when at length the house door bell was loudly rung, and immediately afterwards Mr. Stephen Corbold entered the drawing room, looking more assured, and, as Helen thought, more detestable than ever. Having deliberately sipped his tea, and indulged himself the while in a long steady stare in the face of the unfortunate object of his passion, he at length rose, and with an air of much confidential importance, raising himself on his toes, and playing with his watch chain, approached Mrs. Cartwright and whispered something in her ear. "Have the kindness to ring the bell, Mr. Hetherington," said the lady, addressing the curate, who, according to his frequent custom, had taken his tea at the Park, partly for the advantage of receiving the instructions of his principal upon sundry little points of church and village discipline, and partly for the hope of finding some one among the young ladies less cruel than the inexorable Henrietta, who had never appeared to see him from the moment they parted in the shrubbery. "Tell Curtis to carry lights to my dressing room," said Mrs. Cartwright to the servant who answered the bell. The vicar's heart gave a bound. 1 hour more, and he should clutch it. 1 short hour more, and he should at last be the master of his own destiny, dependent on no fond woman's whim, trembling before no children's power to change her purpose. "Once I let her sign this will," thought he, "and if I ever leave her long enough unwatched to make another, the fault will be my own, and I will abide the consequence." With a placid countenance that manifested no emotion of any kind, Mr. Cartwright amused himself for a few minutes in examining a drawing just finished for the fancy fair, by the light of a lamp on the chimney piece, and as he passed behind his cousin to set it down, he condescendingly stopped to show it to him, pointing out its merits with affectionate admiration, for the artist was no other than his accomplished lady. "Is not the expression of this head beautifully holy, cousin Stephen? Just look at the eyes. Chivers the butler, her maid Curtis, and my valet can witness it. Charming, is it not?" In a short time afterward Mrs. Cartwright rose, the attentive attorney sprang to the door, opened it, and silently followed her out of the room. Henrietta's eyes followed them, and she sighed heavily. "You do not seem well to night, Miss Cartwright," said Helen, "and I do not feel gay. What say you to our keeping each other in countenance, and both going to bed though the clock has not yet struck 10? "A comfortable and very wise proposal," replied Henrietta, rising at once. "I am much more inclined to be in bed than up, for I would rather be asleep than awake." "It is very right for you, Henrietta, who are an invalid, to be indulged in your wish to retire early," said her father. "Good night. I am sorry that the accidental absence of your mother renders it impossible for me to hasten the hour of evening prayer. But you shall have my blessing. May Heaven watch over your slumbers if you close your eyes in faith. If not, may he visit you in the night season with such appalling thoughts as may awaken a right spirit within you. But for you, my dear child," he continued, turning to Helen, "I cannot suffer you to leave us so prematurely. We shall have prayers within an hour, and I do not permit any member of my family to absent herself from the performance of this sacred ordinance, without very good and sufficient reason for so doing." "I conceive that I have very good and sufficient reason for so doing, sir," replied Helen, approaching the door. "I wish you all good night." "She shall pay for this," whispered one of the little demons that nestled in the vicar's heart. "Stephen must absolve me of my promise for to night; but if I do not keep it with him nobly on some future occasion, I will give him leave to tear in fragments the parchment which at this very moment is growing into a rod wherewith to scourge the insolence of this proud vixen." It was probably not so much the failing to keep his promise with Corbold, which the late hour might readily excuse, as the displaying to his slave and curate that his power was not absolute, which galled him so severely. His wife and cousin, however, soon returned. They both looked placidly contented, as those do look who, having had important business to transact, have done it well and thoroughly. Soon afterwards the numerous household were summoned to appear, and the labours of the day were closed with prayer, Mr. Hetherington uttering the extempore invocation, and the vicar pronouncing the blessing, an arrangement, by the way, approved by the master of Cartwright Park for three especial reasons. First, it gave to his establishment very greatly the effect of having a domestic chaplain at its head. Secondly, it afforded an opportunity which the worthy Mr. Hetherington never neglected, of calling down sundry especial blessings on the vicar's own particular head, and, which was perhaps more important still, of pronouncing a lofty eulogium on his transcendent virtues. Thirdly, the having to rise from his knees and pronounce the final blessing never failed to soothe his spirit with a delicious foreboding that he might one day do so likewise in his own cathedral and from his own proper throne, this being an object of ambition to him as dear or dearer still than the possession of the precious will itself. Rarely indeed did he seat himself in his own soft chair, in his own noble library, without seeing in his mind's eye a mitre, as distinctly visible as Macbeth's air-drawn dagger was to him; and the hope that this crowning blessing would one day fall upon his favoured head, not only cheered every waking, and often every sleeping hour, but made him so generously come forward upon all occasions when a penniless Whig was to be accommodated with a seat in a parliament, or any other subscription set on foot to help the radical poor and needy into political power and place, that he was already considered in the high places as one of the most conscientious and right-minded clergymen within the pale of the established church, and almost supernaturally gifted, considering he was not a Roman Catholic priest, with the power of judging political characters according to their real value. As soon as the prayers were ended, the blessings spoken, and the servants dismissed, Mr. Corbold, whose eyes had vainly wandered round the room in search of Helen, approached the vicar, and said in a very firm and intelligible tone, "I wish to speak to you, cousin Cartwright." "Certainly," replied his kinsman in a voice of the most cordial friendship. "Come into my library with me, cousin Stephen." And into the library they went, and almost before the door was shut, Mr. Corbold exclaimed, "How am I to see Miss Helen, cousin Cartwright, if you have let her take herself off to bed?" This very pertinent question was, however, only answered by another. "Have you got the will, cousin Stephen?" "Yes, I have," answered the attorney with more boldness than he had ever used in speaking to his cousin since he became a great man. "But a bargain's a bargain." "I know it is, cousin, and Heaven preserve to me my lawful rights and inheritance, as I faithfully keep to you the word I have given." "And how is it to be managed, then? Am I to go to the girl's bedroom?" "Give me the will, cousin Stephen," said the vicar, holding out his hand to receive it, "and I will satisfy you fully upon this matter." Mr. Corbold, however, looked extremely rebellious, and no corner of parchment could be descried about any part of his person. "A bargain's a bargain, I tell you, cousin William," he repeated doggedly; "and you may as well remember that a lawyer that is entrusted with the keeping of a will is no way bound to give it up, particularly to the party whom it chiefly concerns." Mr. Cartwright measured his contumacious relative with his eye, very much as if he intended to floor and rifle him; but wiser thoughts prevailed, and he gently replied, seating himself in his own peculiar chair, and making a sign to his companion that he should place himself opposite, "May he, cousin Stephen, whose professing servants we are, save and deliver us from quarrelling with one another, especially at a blessed moment like this, when everything seems fitted by his holy providence, so as to assure us peace and prosperity in this world, and doubtless everlasting glory in the life to come." "All that's very true, cousin Cartwright; and if your cloth and calling set you to speak of heavenly things, a special grace, years ago manifested in me, makes me nothing behind you in the same. But for all that, I know well enough that there's many a worldly minded unprofessing lawyer who would gain credit and honour both by taking care to let young Mowbray know what that pious lady his mother has been about, instead of keeping the thing as secret as if it were a forgery of my own. And it is but common justice between man and man, to say nothing of cousins and professing Christians, that conduct so every way convenient and considerate as mine should not go unrewarded. I have set my heart upon having that girl Helen, and I don't wish for anything in the end but lawful wedlock, and all that, and the more because I take it for granted that you don't mean altogether to leave the young woman without fortune. But she's restive, cousin, and that you know, and we are therefore called upon as men and Christians to make use and profit of that wit and strength which it hath pleased Providence in its wisdom to give us over the weaker vessel. And all I ask of you is so to put it within my reach and power to do this, that the righteous ends we have in view may be obtained through the same." "I have heard you to the end, cousin Stephen, which will, I trust, considering all things, be accepted in token of an humble spirit. What you have said, however, excepting that it was needless, is altogether reasonable, and betokens that wisdom of which the Lord hath seen fit to make you an example upon the earth. But you find that my conscience needed not your reproof. Few hours have passed since I gave proof sufficient of the sincerity with which I desire to strengthen the ties between us. By the accident of the post-bag's being brought into my room, I was made aware that it contained a letter addressed to Helen Mowbray, evidently in the handwriting of a man. And what could it be to me, cousin Stephen, whether that unconverted girl got a letter from a man or went without it? Nothing, positively nothing. But I remembered me of you, cousin, and of the tender affections which you had fixed upon her, and, fearless of consequences, I instantly broke the seal, and found, as I expected, a very worldly minded proposal of marriage, without the decency of any allusion whatever to my will in the business. And I therefore of course felt it my duty to destroy it, both for your sake and that of the Lord, whose blessing the impious young man did not deem it necessary to mention. Nevertheless, the proposal came from one of the first families in the county, and the girl would have been my lady in due course of nature, a thing not altogether without value to her family and father-in-law. But I never hesitated for one moment, and you may see the ashes of Colonel Harrington's love letter under the grate." "That was acting like the good and chosen servant, cousin William, that I have long known you to be. But such being the case, why have you scrupled to let me speak to the young girl this night in private?" "For the good and sufficient reason that she chose to go, even though I told her to stay, and without exposing myself to a very unpleasant scene before my curate and the rest of my people, I could not have detained her. Besides, at the moment of her departure, I knew that the will which you still keep from me, cousin Stephen, was not either signed or executed. Another good and sufficient reason, as I take it, for not choosing to keep the girl back by force. But fear nothing. What I have promised, that I will perform. Give me the will, cousin Stephen, and I will tell you what my scheme is for you." "Tell me the scheme first, cousin William. That is but square and fair. We lawyers have got our ceremonies as well as the clergy, and I don't see why they should be broken through." "I don't very well know what you mean by ceremonies in this case, cousin, and I don't think you take the best way to oblige me. However, I am not going to shrink from my word for that. All I expect, cousin Stephen, is your word pledged to me in return, that, let what will happen, you will bring no scandal or dishonour upon my family. for so doing might be of the greatest injury to my hopes." "I mean nothing but honour, cousin William," replied Corbold eagerly. "Let me have but a fair opportunity given me, and you shall find that, though I use it, I will not abuse it. Tell me then, what is your scheme?" "You know that on the 12th of this month a serious fancy fair is to be held in my grounds. Not only will all the rank and fashion of the county assemble on the occasion, but my park gates will be open likewise to the people. At 2 o'clock a very splendid collation will be ready in 5 of my saloons; and it is after the company have risen and left the tables to resort once more to the booths, in order to assist in the disposal of the remaining articles, that I shall permit every servant in my establishment to leave the mansion and repair to witness the busy and impressive scene in the booths. It will be a very impressive scene, cousin Stephen, for I shall myself pronounce a blessing upon the assembled crowd. From this I fear, my dear Stephen, that you must on this occasion absent yourself; but be assured that as I speak these words of power, I will remember you. When you shall see a rush of my hired servants pour forth from my mansion upon my lawns, it is then that I shall counsel you to retire, enter the house by the library windows, and if questioned, say you are sent there on an errand by me. From my library, find your way up the grand staircase to the small apartment which I permit my wife to appropriate as her dressing room, the same in which you have this night executed, as I trust, her will. There remain, concealed perhaps behind the curtains, till Helen Mowbray enters. I will deposit in that room something valuable and curious for sale, which shall be forgotten till you are safely hidden there, and then I will command my very dear and obedient wife to send Miss Helen to seek for it. Does this plan please you, cousin?" Before speaking a word, Mr. Corbold drew the will from his long coat pocket, and placed it in the hands of the vicar. This was a species of mute eloquence most perfectly understood by the person to whom it was addressed. The Vicar of Wrexhill received the parchment with much solemnity in his 2 hands, and bending his head upon it, exclaimed, "May the blessings of the Lord be with me and my heirs for ever!" It may possibly appear improbable to many persons that such a phrase as this last should recur in ordinary discourse so frequently as I have represented it to do; but to those not belonging to the sect, and therefore not so familiarized with its phraseology as to be unconscious of its peculiarity, and who yet have been thrown by accident within reach of hearing it, I need offer no explanation, for they must know by experience that this, or expressions of equally religious formation and import, are in constant use among them. Sometimes, especially in the company of the profane, they are uttered sotto voce, as if to satisfy the secret conscience. Sometimes, in equally unelect society, they are pronounced aloud and with most distinct emphasis, as if to show that the speaker feared not the ribald laugh of the scorner, and held himself ready to perform this or any other feat likely to ensure the same petty but glorious martyrdom, despite any possible quantum of absurdity that may attach thereto. The 2 kinsmen being now mutually satisfied with each other's conduct, shook hands and parted, Mr. Corbold ruminating, as he walked slowly back to Wrexhill, on the happy termination to which he was at last likely to bring his hitherto unpropitious wooing, and Mr. Cartwright gazing with unspeakable delight on the signatures and seals which secured to him and his heirs for ever the possession of all the wealth and state in which he now revelled. Having satisfied himself that all was right, he opened a secret drawer in his library table, laid the precious parchment within it, and having turned the lock, actually kissed the key that secured his treasure. He then carefully secured it to his watch chain, and returned to escort his lady to her chamber. End of chapter 9. Volume 3, Chapter 10 of The Vicar of Wrexhill. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The Vicar of Wrexhill by Francis Milton Trollope. Volume 3, Chapter 10. The Serious Fancy Fair. There were but few families within an ordinary visiting distance of the Park who had not called on Mrs. Cartwright upon her marriage. Some went from simple curiosity, some expressly to quiz her, a few from feelings of real kindness towards the young people, whom it would be, they said, a shame to give up merely because their mother had played the fool and ruined all their prospects. Not a few for the fun of seeing Mowbray Park turned into a conventicle, and the inhabitants into its congregation; and the rest came principally because Mr. Cartwright was such a pious man, and likely to do so much good in the neighbourhood. Among all these, the fancy fair announced to be held there on the 12th day of July created a lively interest. All the world determined to attend, and half the world gave themselves up to the making of pin-cushions and pen-wipers, with as much zeal as if the entire remnant of the Jewish people, as well as the whole population of Fababo, were to be converted thereby. The mansion and grounds of Mr. Cartwright's residence began to give note of very great and splendid preparation for this serious fête. Never had the reverend vicar been seen in such spirits on any former occasion. His bosom's lord sat lightly on his throne, and due allowance being made for the nature of the proceedings, it might safely be averred that no entertainment ever given in the neighbourhood had caused more sensation, or been prepared for with a more lavish expenditure. The whole of the 9th, 10th, and 11th days of the month were entirely employed by the majority of the Cartwright household in receiving and arranging the difficult works of fancy contributed by the neighbouring ladies for the sale. By far the greater half of these articles were pincushions, and for the most part they packed and unpacked well and safely; but amidst the vast variety of forms into which this favourite vehicle of charity was turned, some among them were equally ingenious in design, delicate in execution, and difficult of carriage. There were harps, of which the strings were actually musical, and the foot a pincushion. Old women of pasteboard, washing their feet in a pasteboard tub, but with knees stuffed for pincushions. Pasteboard hunchbacks, the hunches being pincushions. Babies dressed with the nicest taste and care, their plump little necks and shoulders forming pincushions. Pretty silken volumes, lettered pointed satires, and their yellow edges stuffed for pincushions. Ladies very fashionably dressed, with the crowns of their bonnets and their graceful backs prepared as pincushions. These, and 10,000 more, of which a prolonged description might probably prove tedious, formed the staple commodity of the elegant booths, which stretched themselves in 2 long rows from one extremity of the beautiful lawn to the other. Tracts, so numerous that it would be impossible to give their measure or their value by any other calculation than that of their weight, were made by the ingenuity of the fair and pious contributors to assume a very tempting aspect, bound by their own delicate hands in silks and velvets of every hue to be found between earth and heaven, green and blue inclusive. It would be quite impossible to give anything deserving the name of a catalogue of the articles contributed to this charming exhibition, and it will therefore be better not to attempt it. It will be sufficient to observe that, by a sentiment of elegant refinement which seemed to have pervaded all the contributors, every article to which the idea of utility to attach was scrupulously banished, it not being fair, as some of the ladies very judiciously observed, to injure the poor shopkeepers by permitting the sale of anything that anybody in the world could really wish to buy. One instance of very delicate attention on the part of Mrs. Cartwright towards the hero of the fête deserves to be recorded, as showing both the natural kindness of her temper, and the respect in which every feeling of this celebrated character was held. Among the almost incredible number of devices for winding silks, or for converting them into bobbins, or for some other of the ingenious little contrivances invented for, one hardly knows what, was a very pretty thing, more in the shape of a Jew's harp than anything else. The instant Mrs. Cartwright cast her eyes on this, she ordered it to be withdrawn, observing that, as the Reverend Isaac Isaacs himself was expected to honour the entertainment with his presence, she could by no means permit anything bearing such a name to appear. It may be feared that it was with a far different spirit Mr. Jacob Cartwright, on hearing his stepmother mention this exclusion, and the motive for it, proposed that all the cold chickens and turkeys to be eaten at the banquet should appear without their usual accompaniment of cold hams, a pleasantry which, though it won a smile from his indulgent father, was by no means well received by Mrs. Cartwright. The 12th day of July itself arrived at last, and fortunately was as fine a day as ever shone. Helen asked Rosalind if she remembered the day on which Charles came of age, and the question brought tears to the eyes of both. This, however, was but a trifling exception to the general cheerfulness. All the world really looked as gay as if the fancy fair were not a serious one. In one of the long and elegantly decorated booths, indeed, one silly young girl was heard to exclaim, "Oh, what a beautiful place this would be for dancing!" But the levity was checked by Mr. Cartwright, who, happening to overhear her, replied, "My dear young lady, there is no dancing in heaven." It had been settled among the ladies of the neighbourhood, on the first announcement of this pious and charitable undertaking, that no young ladies, either married or single, should be invited to sell the articles; and for some time after the circulation of this decision, it appeared to be very doubtful whether there would be any ladies found, not actually too decrepit to endure the fatigue, who would be willing to undertake it. This circumstance threw poor Mrs. Cartwright into great embarrassment. The idea of having advertised a fancy fair, and then to be unable to procure ladies to preside at it, was a vexation almost beyond what even a professing Christian's patience could bear. When at length it appeared evident that every middle-aged lady for 10 miles round had, for some excellent good reason or other, declined the office, Mr. Cartwright proposed that gentlemen, instead of ladies, should perform it. But to this Miss Charlotte Richards, who happened to be present when the difficulty was discussed, entered a violent protest, declaring that she was quite sure, if such a measure were resorted to, not 1/100th part of the goods would be sold. Neither Jew nor Gentile, she assured them, would ever make anything by it, if such a project were resorted to. And in short, she pleaded the cause of the ladies so well, that after some time it was agreed that the original principle should be altogether changed, and that the youngest and prettiest ladies should be selected, only with this condition annexed, that they should all be dressed in uniform, the form and material of which were to be specified by Mrs. Cartwright. The circular letter announcing this alteration was composed by Mr. Cartwright himself, and proved perfectly successful, although it contained but few words. It having been decided at a meeting of some of the senior supporters of the South Central African Bible Association, that the cause of the poor inhabitants of Fababo was one which ought to be peculiarly interesting to the young and lovely, inasmuch as it is beyond all others the cause of piety, it was therefore strongly recommended that they should be especially chosen and elected to serve the office of vendors or sellers at the fancy fair instituted by the Reverend William Jacob Cartwright, and by him appointed to be held on his own premises. After which followed a request that such ladies as were kindly willing to undertake the fatigues of the office would forthwith forward their names to Mrs. Cartwright, that they might receive from her instructions respecting the uniform to be worn on the occasion. The number of applications for permission to sell, which followed the circulation of this letter, was quite extraordinary, and so greatly exceeded the number required, that the task of selection became difficult, if not impossible. So it was finally decided that a description of the uniform should be sent to them all, and that those who arrived first should be installed in their office under condition of permitting a relay to succeed them after the enjoyment of 2 hours of duty. The consequence of this was, that at a very early hour, not only all the young and handsome part of the company expected, but all who considered themselves as belonging to that class, were seen arriving in their very becoming sad-coloured suits, with their smooth braided tresses, and Quakerish bonnets and caps. "Let all the ladies in the serious uniform stand up together behind the stalls if they like it," said the accommodating Mrs. Cartwright. "It would be so very difficult to select, and they all look so very well." As the stalls were all ready, having been walked round, through, and about by Mr. and Mrs. Cartwright, Mr. Hetherington the curate, Chivers the butler, Curtis the lady's maid, as well as all the other serious servants, and all agreeing in the opinion that it was impossible anything could be more beautiful, the uniform ladies were ushered into them, and begged to decide among themselves the order in which they should stand. The manner in which this self-regulating system worked was amusing, and Rosalind Torrington stood by and enjoyed it greatly. As soon as it was notified to the young and pretty ladies that the booths were all ready, the prices of every article marked, and all the things prepared, so that they might take their places behind the stands in such order as they should agree among themselves, any one who had witnessed and watched the sweet universal smile with which each one regarded the other, and the charming accents in which all exclaimed as with one voice, "Oh, it is exactly the same to me where I stand!" would have been ready to declare that even their youth and beauty were less attractive than the sweet temper which seemed to be so universal among them. The fair bevy, amounting to above 50, poured themselves by various entrances into the booths, which were in fact a succession of very handsome tents, against the sides of which were ranged the elegantly decorated stands, while through the whole extent a space of nearly 30 feet was left for promenading. In the centre of the range, the gaily painted canvas rose to a lofty point, from which, to the extremity of the circle round it, depended graceful draperies festooned with large bunches of flowers. In the middle of this noble circular tent stood a lofty frame, supporting the finest greenhouse plants, and the stalls which here skirted the sides of the enclosure were decidedly more distinguished by their elegant decorations than the rest. "Oh dear, how lovely!" was the universal exclamation uttered by the ladies on entering this beautiful circle. "Well, I think I will stand here," said one of the most lively and enterprising among them, placing herself at the same time behind a world of many tinted paper and silk commodities, close to which was a side entrance arched with evergreen boughs, and gay with 1,000 blossoms. "And I will take this stand," cried a stout and long-limbed demoiselle, stepping out with great activity to secure the one opposite. "This will just suit me," said a third, popping into another of the enviable stations which flanked the garlanded entrances, and immediately taking possession of its lofty seat and comfortable footstool. Up to this point the universal smile continued, with an almost unabated display of charming teeth. But to the fourth place, promising equal affluence of passers-by to the three already taken, no less than 4 ladies rushed at once, and then began the civil war which in a greater or lesser degree, as circumstances may excite or assuage it, rages at all fancy fairs, bazaars, and charity sales of every class and denomination whatever. Some folks, uninitiated in such matters, may suppose that there is less of this at a serious fancy fair than at one professing to be gay. But a little experience will rapidly undeceive them. Whether the benevolent sale ladies be beautiful saints or beautiful sinners, the inclination to show off nature's gifts to the best advantage is pretty nearly the same; and whether the sweet graceful thanks, so softly uttered, be constructed after one form or another, the pleasure of speaking them is the same likewise. What matters it, whether a bright eye laugh from behind a drapery of pendant curls, or is raised to heaven with no twisted meshes to obscure its upward ray? What matters it whether ruby lips open to say, "Heaven reward you, sir! Our poor missionaries shall pray for you," or "Thank you," with familiar nod, "some dear Spanish whiskerandos shall buy a sword with this." In both cases the speaker would indisputably prefer having a well-frequented stand to speak from, and if it chanced to be placed beside some avenue through which the crowd must pass and repass incessantly, why, so much the better. The 4 ladies that met together with more of haste than inclination at the last of the doorway stands, as above described, were really, considering all things, exceedingly civil to each other. At the early part of a busy day, the temper can bear much more without wincing, than after it has been battered and bruised by all the little contretemps that are almost sure to beset it before the close of it. "I beg your pardon, ma'am, but I believe I was here first." "Oh dear, I hope I did not hurt you, but this is my place." "You must let me stand here, dear ladies, for I have set my heart upon it," comprised very nearly all the spoken part of the contest. A few sidelong glances there might have been, and 1 or 2 almost invisible nudges; but after all, the person who finally got possession of the desired post was a tall, thin, pale, and remarkably pious maiden, who, having laid her hand upon the board and her foot upon the stool, moved them no more, but who from first to last did not pronounce a single word. Though these 4 favourite seats were thus rapidly taken possession of, there was still a good deal to be struggled for. It appeared indeed for some time that all the 50 young and handsome ladies had firmly made up their minds to station themselves in the circular tent, and nowhere else. Greatly did the peaceable Mrs. Cartwright rejoice that she had from the first desired the ladies to please themselves, for it soon became evident that it would have been no easy task for her to please them. Very continuous buzzings made themselves heard around the canvas walls, and ladylike remonstrances were occasionally audible. "Really, ladies, I think we are very close here." "Would it not be better for some of the ladies to move on?" "I believe, ma'am, that you will find no room just here." And "Upon my word, I must beg you not to press upon me so," were sentences distinctly repeated in more places than one. At length things, or rather ladies, began to arrange themselves in tolerable order, the difficulties being got over at last, as always happens upon such occasions, by the best tempers taking the worst places. It was an almost simultaneous rush of carriages through the park gates, and the approach of many persons on foot by various entrances, which at last produced this desirable effect. Mr. Cartwright now came forth in all his glory from beneath the shelter of a sort of canvas portico that formed the entrance to the principal line of tents. Almost innumerable were the hands he shook, the bows he made, and the smiles he smiled. It is perfectly impossible that he could have sustained so radiant and benevolent a graciousness to all sorts and conditions of men, had not his animal spirits been sustained by the ever-present recollection that the little key which dangled from his watch-chain, and with which he constantly dallied when any of his 10 fingers were disengaged from hand-shaking, kept watch and ward over his lady's will. Mrs. Cartwright, meanwhile, not being in a situation to endure the fatigue of standing, sat with some dozen chairs around her, waiting for the most distinguished guests, within the flowery shelter of this same pretty portico, round which were ranged orange trees and various other fragrant plants, reaching from the ground almost to the roof. Whenever any person arrived of sufficient importance to be so distinguished, the Vicar of Wrexhill himself ushered them to the presence of his lady, and those so honoured at length filled all the chairs around her. To all the rest Mrs. Cartwright bowed and smiled as they passed onward, as they all most obediently did, in compliance with the mandate of their host, who continued to utter with little intermission, "Straight on, if you please, straight on, and you will reach the centre pavilion." Between the spot at which the carriages set down the company and the entrance to this portico, 4 servants in rich liveries were stationed to pass their names to chivers who stood within it. At length the party, who had walked across the park and entered the lawn by the little hand gate, to pass through which the present master of the domain had once considered as his dearest privilege, approached the entrance at a point by which they escaped 3 out of the 4 reverberations of their names, and were very quietly stepping under the draperied entrance, when the 4th now stopped them short to demand their style and title. "Mrs. and the Miss Richards, Lord Hilton," screamed the trumpet-mouthed London-bred domestic, who, it may be observed in passing, had, like most of his fellows, answered one of Mr. Cartwright's advertisements, headed thus: "Wanted, to live in the country, a serious footman." No sooner did the title reach the vicar's ears than he dropped pious Mr. Somebody's hand, which he was affectionately pressing, and turning short round, met the cold glance of the honest-hearted Major Dalrymple, who advanced with Mrs. Richards upon one arm, and his affianced Mary on the other. A moment of rather awkward deliberation ensued, as to whether the man, or the man's title, should modify the manner of his reception. But before the question could be decided, the party had quietly passed on, without appearing to perceive him. The 2 elder Miss Richards followed, both of them having been obliged to relinquish their hopes of presiding at a stand, in consequence of the expensive nature of the uniform. These 2 young ladies, who from the first hour of their conversion had really been among the most faithful followers of the Vicar of Wrexhill in all ways, ready to be in love with him, ready to pray with him, and now ready to bow before him as almost the greatest man in the county, were not perhaps greeted with all the distinguished kindness they deserved. Unfortunately for their feeling, Mr. Cartwright was more awake to the fact that they were sisters to little Mary, than to their very excellent chance of becoming sisters-in-law to a nobleman. And so they too passed on, without pausing, as they had intended to do, for the expression of their unbounded admiration for him and his fancy fair. Nearly the whole of the invited society were already assembled, and the park was beginning to fill with the multitude which was to be admitted to the tents after the collation, when at length the Reverend Isaac Isaacs was announced. The arrival of the hero of the day produced, as may be supposed, a very powerful sensation. His name was no sooner pronounced by the servants than it was caught up by the company, and borne along from mouth to mouth, till every individual of the crowd which filled the tents was made acquainted with the interesting fact that the Reverend Isaac Isaacs was approaching. The effect of this was for some moments really alarming. Every Christian soul turned back to welcome the converted Jew, and something nearly resembling suffocation ensued. Indeed, when the throng which pressed back to meet him met that which had turned to follow him as he laboured to make his way between the stands, the crush was really terrible; and had there not fortunately been many lateral exits through which those escaped who loved their lives better than the gratification of their curiosity, the consequences might have been very serious. Not all, however, whose strength and whose zeal induced them to remain, could get a sight of this desired of all eyes; for, as Mr. Isaacs was a very short man, those only who were very close could distinguish him. The effect of this procession, however, through the double row of stands, still thickly studded with pincushions, every one of which had been made for his sake, was very impressive, and rendered greatly more so by every fair saleswoman mounting upon the high seat with which she was furnished for occasional rest, and thus looking down upon him as he passed in attitudes that displayed both courage and enthusiasm. The weather was intensely hot, and more than once he appeared nearly overcome by his emotions. He expressed the greatest concern for having arrived so late, and especially for having missed the opening prayer, which, as he imagined, had been pronounced by Mr. Cartwright himself. But when it was explained to him that this was not the case, and moreover that he was not too late to share the blessing to be given by that gentleman, he became more reconciled to the accident which had detained him, and gave himself wholly up to the enjoyment of the striking spectacle that surrounded him. After he had remained for some time in the central pavilion, gazing and gazed at, in a manner which it was extremely interesting to watch, some one well acquainted with the best method of carrying on the business of such a meeting as the present, suggested that it would be advisable that the acolyte should retire till the sale of the goods was pretty well completed; for if the feeling among the charitable crowd were permitted to exhaust itself in affectionate glances towards Mr. Isaacs, no more money would be collected; and it was also judiciously remarked that it might be as well to circulate through the company the assurance that as soon as the stalls were about 2/3 cleared, the banquet would be announced. The effect of these suggestions was speedily visible. Mr. Isaacs stood in the enjoyment of space and fresh air before the entrance to the portico, engrossing the almost undivided attention of his great patron, while ladies peeped at him from a respectful distance, and Chivers himself, with a look as reverential as if he were waiting upon an apostle, approached him with Madeira and soda water. The sale, meanwhile, benefited equally by his near presence and his actual absence. Enthusiasm was raised without being disturbed in that great object of all English Christian enthusiasm, the disbursing of money; and by 4 o'clock such a report was made of the general receipts, that the selling ladies were waited upon by as many clergymen as could be collected to hand them from their stands to the banquet; and when these were all furnished with a fair partner, the most serious gentlemen among the company were requested to take charge of the rest. Mrs. Cartwright herself was led to the great dining room by Mr. Isaacs, and for this reason, or else because it was the great dining room, the crowd which followed her became so oppressive that the doors of the room were ordered to be closed and strictly guarded. This measure was equally serviceable to those within and without, for no sooner was it fully understood that this decisive mode had been resorted to, than the other tables were instantly filled, and nothing could be more satisfactory than the activity with which eating and drinking proceeded in all directions. The champagne flowed freely, and whether it were that the sacred cause for which the meeting was assembled appeared to justify, or at least excuse, some little excess, or that nothing furnished at Mr. Cartwright's board but must bring a blessing to him who swallowed it, or that the fervent season led to thirst, and thirst to copious libations, whatever the cause, it is certain that a very large quantity of wine was swallowed that day, and that even the most serious of the party felt their spirits considerably elevated thereby. But in recording this fact, it should be mentioned likewise that excepting in some few instances, in which thirst, good wine, and indiscretion united to overpower some unfortunate individuals, the serious gentlemen of the party, though elevated, were far from drunk, and the tone of their conversation only became more animated, without losing any portion of the peculiar jargon which distinguished it when they were perfectly sober. The discourse especially which was carried on round Mr. Cartwright after the ladies retired was for the most part of the most purely Calvinistical cast, though some of the anecdotes related might perhaps in their detail have partaken more of the nature of miracles than they would have done if fewer champagne corks had saluted the ceiling. One clerical gentleman, for instance, a Mr. Thompson, who was much distinguished for his piety, stated as a fact which had happened to himself that in his early days, before the gift of extempore preaching was fully come upon him, he was one Sabbath day at the house of a reverend friend, who, being taken suddenly ill, desired Mr. Thompson to preach for him, at the same time furnishing him with the written discourse which he had been himself about to deliver. "I mounted the pulpit," said Mr. Thompson, "with this written sermon in my pocket; but the moment I drew it forth and opened it, I perceived to my inexpressible dismay that the handwriting was totally illegible to me. For a few moments I was visited with heavy doubts and discomfiture of spirit, but I had immediate recourse to prayer. I closed the book, and implored that its characters might be made legible to me, and when I opened it again, the pages seemed to my eyes to be as a manuscript of my own." This statement, however, was not only received with every evidence of the most undoubting belief, but an elderly clergyman, who sat near the narrator, exclaimed with great warmth, "I thank you, sir, I thank you greatly, Mr. Thompson, for this shining example of the effect of ready piety and ready wit. Though the cloth is removed, sir, I must ask to drink a glass of wine with you, and may Heaven continue to you its especial grace." There were some phrases, too, which, though undoubtedly sanctioned by serious usage, sounded strangely when used in a scene apparently of such gay festivity. One gentleman confessed very frankly his inability to resist taking more of such wine as that now set before them than was altogether consistent with his own strict ideas of ministerial propriety. "But," added he, "though in so yielding I am conscious of being in some sort wrong, I feel intimately persuaded at the same time that by thus freely demonstrating the strength and power of original sin within me, I am doing a service to the cause of religion, by establishing one of its most important truths." This apology was received with universal applause. It manifested, as one of the company remarked, equal soundness of faith and delicacy of conscience. One of the most celebrated of the regular London speakers, known at all meetings throughout the whole evangelical season, having silently emptied a bottle of claret, which he kept close to him, began, just as he had finished the last glass, to recover the use of his tongue. His first words were, "My king has been paying me a visit." "Indeed!" said Mr. Cartwright, whose attention was instantly roused by this very interesting statement. "Where was the visit made, Mr. White?" "Even here, sir," replied Mr. White solemnly. "Here, since I have been sitting silently at your hospitable board." "As how, sir?" inquired a certain Sir William Crompton, who was placed near him. "Do you mean that you have been sleeping, and that his majesty has visited you in your dreams?" "The Majesty that I speak of, sir," replied Mr. White, "is the King of Heaven." "What other could it be?" exclaimed Mr. Cartwright, showing the whites of his eyes, and appearing scandalized at the blunder. "I wonder, Mr. Cartwright," said a young man of decidedly pious propensities, but not as yet considering himself quite assured of his election, "I wonder, Mr. Cartwright, whether I shall be saved or not." "It is a most interesting question, my young friend," replied the vicar mildly, "and you really cannot pay too much attention to it. I am happy to see that it leaves you not, even at the festive board, and I sincerely hope it will finally be settled to your satisfaction. But as yet it is impossible to decide." "I shall not fail to ride over to hear you preach, excellent Mr. Cartwright," said a gentleman of the neighbourhood, who, though not hitherto enrolled in the evangelical calendar, was so struck on the present occasion with the hospitable entertainment he received, that he determined to cultivate the acquaintance. "You do me great honour, sir," replied the vicar. "If you do, I hope it will be on a day when you can stay supper with us." "You are excessively kind, my dear sir," answered the guest; "but as my place is at least 10 miles distant from yours, I fear if you sup in the same style that you dine, it will be somewhat late before I got home." Mr. Cartwright bowed, dropping his eyes, and said nothing. "Oh, sir," said Mr. Hetherington, who, though he had drunk more than any man at table excepting the cousin Corbold, had as yet in no degree lost his apprehension, "oh, sir, you quite mistake. The supper that the excellent Mr. Cartwright means is to be taken at the table of the Lord." "Dear me!" exclaimed the squire, who really meant to be both civil and serious. "I beg pardon. I made a sad blunder indeed." "There is nothing sad but sin, Mr. Wilkins," replied the vicar meekly. "A mistake is no sin. Even I myself have sometimes been mistaken." "What heavenly minded humility there is in Mr. Cartwright!" said Mr. Hetherington in a loud whisper to his neighbour. "Every day he lives seems to elevate my idea of his character. Is not this claret admirable, Mr. Dickson?" Just at this moment Chivers the butler entered the room and whispered something in his master's ear. "Indeed!" exclaimed Mr. Cartwright. "A very disagreeable accident, upon my word." "What is it, sir?" inquired several voices at once. "The head cook, gentlemen," replied Chivers, "has fallen off the larder ladder, and has put out his shoulder." "A very disagreeable accident, indeed!" echoed the guests. The butler whispered again. "Certainly, Chivers, certainly. I am very glad Mr. Bird, the surgeon, happens to be on the premises. Let him immediately set the joint. And when this is done, and the poor fellow laid comfortably in bed, come for Mr. Hetherington, whom I will immediately order to awaken him." "Bless my soul, sir!" exclaimed the good-natured Sir William Crompton, "won't that be rather injudicious? If the poor fellow should get a nap, I should think it would be the worst thing in the world to awaken him." "Pardon me, Sir William," replied the vicar with great respect, "but persons of the world do not well understand the language of those who are not of the world. No accident, no illness ever occurs in my house, Sir William, but my first effort is to awaken the soul of the sufferer to a proper sense of his sins. I always take care they shall be told that the jaws of the tomb are opening before them, and that, as death comes like a thief in the night, they should be watching for him. This, in the language of a pious and professing Christian, is called an awakening, and needful as it is at all times, it is of course more needful still in sickness or danger of any kind." Sir William Crompton filled his glass with the wealthy vicar's admirable wine, and said no more. The time was now approaching at which the populace were to be admitted to the tents on the lawn, and Mr. Cartwright, having looked at his watch, rose and said, "Gentlemen, it is distressing to me to be forced to disturb you, but the business of the meeting requires that we should all repair to the lawn. The populace are about to be admitted, and it is expected that our estimable Mr. Isaacs will benefit very considerably by the eagerness with which the farmers' wives and daughters will purchase the articles which remain of our Christian lady's elegant handiworks. One bumper to the success of the Reverend Isaac Isaacs, and to the conversion of the people of Fababo. And now we will return to our duty in the tents." "To your tents, O Israel!" shouted a young man with more of wine than wit, as he turned towards the converted Jew. "For myself," he added, "I'll be damned if I stir an inch till I have finished this bottle." Mr. Cartwright stopped short in his progress towards the door. He turned a glance, more inquiring perhaps than stern, on the face of the intoxicated speaker, and perceived that he was the nephew of an earl, the sole reason indeed which had procured him the honour of a seat in that distinguished circle. The vicar balanced for a moment whether he should reprimand him or not. Had he been the son instead of the nephew of the noble lord, he would certainly have passed on in holy meditation; but as it was, he stopped. There were many serious eyes upon him, notwithstanding the claret. He remembered that the earl had a goodly progeny, and that consequently his nephew would never be likely to succeed to his title; and therefore, with great dignity and much pious solemnity, he thus addressed his curate, who, in his capacity of domestic chaplain, was ever near him. "Mr. Hetherington, you have heard the awful words spoken by Mr. Augustus Mappleton. Remember, sir, that his repentance and conversions be prayed for at our concluding service this evening, and also in your extempore prayer before sermon on next Sabbath morning." These words had a very sobering effect on the company, and the whole party made, all things considered, a very orderly exit from the dining room, not, however, without Mr. Cartwright finding an opportunity of whispering in the ear of his cousin, "Now is your time, Stephen, to go into the dressing room." End of Volume 3, Chapter 10. Volume 3, Chapter 11 of the Vicar of Wrexhill. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The Vicar of Wrexhill by Francis Milton Trollope. Volume 3, Chapter 11. The Elopement. When the gentlemen reached the lawn, they found it already covered, not only with the company from all the other rooms, but likewise with crowds of people from the park, who came rushing in through different entrances from all quarters. In the midst of all this bustle and confusion, however, Mr. Cartwright remembered his engagement with Mr. Stephen Corbold, and, only waiting till he saw that the servants of his house were among the throng, he sought Mrs. Cartwright, and finding, as he expected, her daughter close beside her, whispered in her ear, "Oblige me, dearest Clara, by sending Helen to your dressing room for a small packet of very important papers which I left on the chimney piece. I cannot go myself, and there is not a servant to be found." Mrs. Cartwright immediately spoke the command to Helen, and the vicar had the satisfaction of watching her make her way through the crowd and enter the window of the drawing room. Poor Helen was not happy enough to have enjoyed in any degree the splendid bustle of the day, and the total repose and silence of the house was quite refreshing to her. She passed through the drawing room into the hall, from whence not even the loud buzz of the multitude without could reach her, and untying her bonnet, and throwing that and her scarf on a slab, she sat down to enjoy for a few moments the cool quiet of the lofty silent room. At length she reluctantly rose to perform her mother's bidding, walked slowly and languidly up the stairs, along the spacious corridor, and into Mrs. Cartwright's drawing room. This little apartment was no longer the dear familiar scene of maternal fondness that it once was, or Helen might here again have been tempted to sit down for the enjoyment of temporary repose. But in truth she no longer loved that dressing room, and walking straight to the chimney piece, she took the packet she found there, and turned to retrace her steps. It was with a start of disagreeable surprise, though hardly of alarm, that she saw Mr. Stephen Corbold standing between her and the door. The persevering impertinence of his addresses had long ago obliged her to decline all communication with him, and it was therefore without appearing to notice him that she now pursued her way towards the door. But hardly had she made a step towards it, when the odious wretch enclosed her in his arms. She uttered a loud shriek, and by a violent effort disengaged herself; but ere she could reach the door, he had closed, locked it, and put the key in his pocket. A dreadful sensation of terror now seized upon her, yet even then she remembered that she was in her mother's house, and a feeling of confidence returned. "You are intoxicated, sir," said she, drawing back from him towards the bell; "but you surely cannot be so mad as to insult me here." "I will insult you nowhere, Miss Helen, if you will behave as you ought to do to the man whom Heaven hath chosen for your husband. But as for your ringing the bell, or screeching either, I'll fairly tell you at once, it is of no use. There is not a single human being left in the house but our two selves, so you may as well give me satisfaction at once, and promise to marry me without more trouble, or else I will make you thankful for the same, without my ever asking you again." "Open that door, sir, and let me out instantly," said Helen, pale as death, yet still not believing that the monster before her would dare to attempt any outrage. "Even Mr. Cartwright," she added, "would resent any impertinence offered to me under my mother's roof. Let me pass, sir. Believe me, you had better." "Believe me, I had better not, Miss Helen. You have been playing the fool with me long enough. And as to my cousin Cartwright, he is quite of the same opinion, I assure you. "Charming Helen!" he exclaimed, again stretching out his arms to enclose her. "Be only half as kind as you are beautiful, and we shall be the happiest couple in the world." "At least, sir, you must let me consult my mother about it," said Helen, contriving to keep the table between them, and believing that he was there only in consequence of his being intoxicated. "Let me ask my mother's consent, Mr. Corbold." Corbold laughed again. "You think me tipsy, my sweet girl, but if I am, trust me, it's no more than just to give me courage to teach you your duty. My charming Helen, let go the table, and understand the thing at once. My cousin Mr. Cartwright is under some obligations to me, and he means to settle them all by giving me a pretty fortune with you. And as he knows that unhappily you are not converted as yet, and have shown yourself not over Christian like in return for my love, it is he himself who invented this scheme of having you sent up here when all the servants were out of the house, and of my being here ready to meet you, and to teach you your duty to him, and to your mother, and to your heavenly Father, and to me. And so now you know all and everything, and I have got the key of the room in my pocket. And will you consent to be my wife, beginning from this very minute?" Dreadful as Helen's terror was, her senses did not leave her. On the contrary, all the strength of her mind seemed to be roused, and her faculties sharpened by the peril that beset her. She doubted not for a moment that his statement respecting Mr. Cartwright's part in this villainy was true, and that she was indeed left in the power of this detested being, with no help but the protection of Heaven and her own courage. She fixed her eyes steadily on that of Corbold, and perceived that as he talked, the look of intoxication increased. She therefore skilfully prolonged the conversation by asking him, if indeed she must be his wife, where they were to live, whether her sister Fanny might live with them, whether he ever meant to take her to London, and the like, contriving as she did so to push the table which still continued between them in such a direction as to leave her between it and the door of her mother's bedchamber. Corbold was evidently losing his head, and appeared aware of it, for he stopped short in his replies and professions of passionate love that he was making, and exclaiming with an oath that he would be trifled with no longer, he suddenly thrust the table from between them, and again threw his arms round Helen's waist. She was not, however, wholly unprepared to receive him. On first approaching the table that had hitherto befriended her, she perceived on it a large vial of spirits of hartshorn. This she had taken possession of, and held firmly in her hand, and at the moment that Corbold bent his audacious head to kiss her, she discharged the whole contents upon his eyes and face, occasioning a degree of blindness and suffocation that for the moment totally disabled him. He screamed with the sudden pain, and raised his hands to his tortured eyes. Before he removed them, Helen had already passed through her mother's bedroom, and was flying by a back staircase to the servants' room below. Without waiting to see if she were pursued, she opened a back door that led into the stable yard, and after a moment's consideration, proceeded across it into a lane which led in one direction to the kitchen gardens, and in the other into the road to Oakley. Even at that moment Helen had time to remember that if she turned her steps towards the kitchen gardens, she should pass by a park gate which would immediately lead her to all the safety that the protection of an assembled multitude could give. But she remembered also that in a few hours she should again be left in the hands of Mr. Cartwright, and inwardly uttering a solemn vow that nothing should ever again make her wilfully submit to this, she darted forward, unmindful of her uncovered head, and with a degree of speed more proportioned to her agitation than her strength, pursued the short cut across the fields to Oakley, and entering the grounds by the gate which led to the lawn, perceived Sir Gilbert, Lady Harrington, and their son, seated on a garden bench, under the shelter of a widely spreading cedar tree. Helen knew that she was now safe, and she relaxed her speed, slowly and with tottering steps, approaching the friends from whom, notwithstanding their long estrangement, her heart anticipated a warm and tender welcome. Yet they did not rise to meet her. Perhaps, thought she, they do not know me. And it was then she recollected that her hair was hanging dishevelled about her face, without hat or cap to shelter it. She was greatly heated, and her breath and strength barely sufficed to bring her within a few yards of the party, when, totally exhausted, she sat down upon the turf and burst into tears. Colonel Harrington had not written the letter to Helen, which the Vicar of Wrexhill destroyed, without having put both his parents in his confidence. Lady Harrington's fond affection for her goddaughter, which her enforced absence had in no degree lessened, rendered the avowal of her son's attachment a matter of unmixed joy; and though Sir Gilbert declared that he would as soon stand in the relation of brother to his satanic majesty as to Cartwright, he at length gave his apparently sulky consent with perhaps as much real pleasure as his lady herself. Both the one and the other, however, knew perfectly well that their son would have been an excellent match for Helen, even when her father was alive, and would, as it was supposed, have given her a fortune of £40,000. And they felt some degree of triumph, neither unamiable nor ungenerous in its nature, at the idea of securing to at least one of poor Mowbray's family a station in society that not even their connection with Mr. Cartwright could tarnish. The whole family understood the position of things at the Park too well to be surprised at no answer being sent express to Colonel Harrington's letter, and the following post was waited for with pleasurable though impatient anxiety. But when it arrived without bringing any answer, and another followed with no notice taken of a proposal of marriage, which, as Sir Gilbert said, the proudest woman in England might have been glad to accept, the misery of the young man himself and the anger and indignation of his parents were about equally vehement. Considering the opinion entertained by Sir Gilbert of what he was pleased to term Mr. Cartwright's finished character, it is surprising that no idea should even have occurred to him of the possible suppression of this important epistle; but in truth the same interpretation of it had suggested itself to the minds of them all. They believed that Helen, from a sense of duty, had submitted the proposal to her mother, and that, forbidden to accept it by the vindictive feelings of the parvenu priest, she had been weak enough to obey even his commands, to leave the letter unanswered, a degree of timidity and want of proper feeling, productive of almost equal disappointment to all three. Impressed with such feelings against her, it is perhaps not very surprising that neither the heart-stricken lover nor his offended parents rose to welcome the approach of poor Helen. "Some family quarrel, I suppose," said Lady Harrington. "They seem to have turned her out of doors in some haste." "I will promise her that she shall not now find an entrance into mine," said Sir Gilbert. "Perhaps the young lady thinks better of it, and that it may be as well to contradict pa and ma a little for the sake of being Mrs. Harrington. Those who will not when they may, when they will they shall have." But before Sir Gilbert could finish his stave, Helen Mowbray was stretched upon the turf. Colonel Harrington, not too well knowing what he did, ran to the spot where she lay, and hardly daring to look at her, stammered out, "Miss Mowbray! Gracious heaven! How fearfully she changes colour! So red, and now so dreadfully pale! Speak to me, Helen! What has happened to you? How comes it that you are here? After... Oh, Helen, open your eyes and speak to me! Mother, she's very ill!" Lady Harrington now rose slowly and gloomily from her seat, and walked to the place where Helen lay, her head supported by the arm of Colonel Harrington. Every tinge of colour fled from her cheeks, her eyes closed, and no symptoms of life remaining, excepting that tears from time to time escaped from beneath her long eyelashes. It is difficult to see a person one has ever loved asleep, and yet retain anger towards them. They look so helpless, so innocent, so free from all that could have ever moved our spleen, that not the most eloquent defence that language ever framed could plead their cause so well as that mute slumber. Still more difficult would it be to look at a fair creature in the state in which Helen now lay, and retain any feeling harsher than pity. "There is something more in all this, William, than we yet understand," said Lady Harrington, after gazing silently at Helen for some minutes. "This poor child has not fainted. Her tears prove that. But she is suffering from bodily fatigue and mental misery. Helen, rouse yourself. Let us understand each other at once. Why did you not reply to my son William's letter?" Helen did rouse herself. She opened her eyes, and fixing them on Lady Harrington, while the colour for a moment rapidly revisited her cheeks, she said in a voice so low as to be scarcely audible, "A letter from Colonel Harrington? To me? A letter to me? I never received it." "Thank Heaven!" cried Colonel Harrington, springing from the ground, for Helen's head no longer rested on his arm. "Ah, what suffering we should have been spared if we had done her but the justice to think of this!" He hastily returned to his father, who, though he had not advanced a step, had risen from his seat, and, to do him justice, was looking towards Helen with great anxiety. "She never received it, sir," said he, in a voice husky from agitation. "Oh, come to her, soothe her with kindness, my dearest father, and all may yet be happiness amongst us." "What, Helen? Helen, my poor girl, are you come to us with some new trouble? And did you indeed never get William's letter, my dear child?" The mention of such a letter again dyed Helen's cheeks with blushes, but she raised her eyes to Sir Gilbert's face, with a look that seemed to ask 1,000 questions, as she replied, "I never received any letter from Colonel Harrington in my life." "I'm devilish glad to hear it, my dear, that's all. So then, you don't know that—" "Hold your peace, Sir Knight," said Lady Harrington, interrupting him, "and you come with me, sweet love. I'll lay my best herbal to that dead leaf, that you're the only one perfectly faultless among us, and that 1, 2, and 3 of us deserve to be, I can hardly tell what. "In the power of the vicar, I think, for having been so villainous as to suspect you, and worse still, for having lived so close to you without ever having found out whether you were really watched like a state prisoner or not." "Has the rascal dared?" cried Sir Gilbert; but before he could finish his sentence, Lady Harrington and her son were leading Helen between them towards the house, her ladyship laying a finger on her lip as she passed her husband, in token that he was to say no more. Having reached what Lady Harrington called a place of safety, where, as she said, the men could neither come nor hear, she made Helen lay herself upon a sofa, and then said, "Now, my Helen, if you are ill at ease in body, lay there quiet, and try to sleep. But if you are only, or chiefly, ill at ease in mind, let your limbs only remain at rest, and relieve yourself and me by telling me everything that has happened since we parted last." "It is a long and sad history, my dearest friend," replied Helen, kissing the hand which still held hers. "But I am very anxious that you should know it all, for so only can the action I have committed to day be excused." "What action, Helen? What is it you have done, my child?" "I have eloped from my mother's house, Lady Harrington." "But you have eloped alone, Helen?" "Yes, alone." "Well then, my dear, I will give you absolution for that. Perhaps there are those among us who may not find it so easy to absolve you from all blame for not doing it before. But now for particulars. Will you have a glass of water, Helen? Mercy on me, I believe it must be a glass of wine. What can you have got to tell? You change colour every moment, my dear child." Helen's narrative, however, being of necessity less full than that contained in the preceding pages, need not be repeated. It was given, indeed, with all the force and simplicity of truth and deep feeling, and told all she knew of Mr. Cartwright's plans and projects. But, excepting what she had that day learned during her dreadful interview with Corbold, she had little to add to what Lady Harrington knew before. This interview, however, was itself fully enough to justify the elopement of which Helen still spoke with such dismay; and together with the fact, again asked for and again repeated, that no letter from Colonel Harrington had reached her hands, was sufficient to make her ladyship burst forth into a passion of indignation against the Vicar of Wrexhill, and to make her, while overpowering Helen with the tenderest caresses, bless her again and again for having at last flown to seek shelter where it would be given with such heartfelt joy. Soothed, consoled, and almost happy as Helen was made by this recovered kindness, her anxiety to know why, and upon what subject Colonel Harrington could have written to her, was becoming every moment more powerful. There was something so very fond, so very maternal in Lady Harrington's manner to her, something that seemed to say that she was of more consequence to her now than she had ever been before, something, in short, quite indescribable, but which gave birth to such delicious hopes in the breast of Helen, that she almost feared to meet the eye of the old lady, lest all she guessed, and all she wished, should be read in her own. It is possible that with all the care she took to avoid the betraying this anxiety, she did not succeed; for in answer to some very delicate and very distant hint, that it was extremely disagreeable to have one's letters intercepted, Lady Harrington, though she only replied, "Yes, it is, Helen," rose and left the room, only adding as she closed the door, "Keep yourself quiet, my dear child. I shall return to you presently." "Presently" is a word that certainly appears by common usage to admit of very considerable variety of interpretation, and it was evident that on the present occasion the two parties between whom it passed understood it differently. Long before Lady Harrington again appeared, Helen felt persuaded that some important circumstance must have occurred to make her so completely change her purpose; yet the good lady herself, when she re-entered the room, looked and was perfectly unconscious of having made any delay at all inconsistent with her presently. She held a folded paper in her hand. "You have not asked me, Helen," she said, "on what subject it was that my son wrote to you, and yet I suspect that you have some wish to know. I have been downstairs to consult him on the best mode of repairing your precious vicar's treachery, and he suggested my putting into your hands the copy of the letter which has been so basely intercepted, which copy, it seems, has remained safely in his desk, while its original has probably fed the flames in Mr. Cartwright's secret chamber, kindling thereby a sympathetic and very consuming fire in the breast of the writer." Helen stretched forth a very trembling hand to receive the paper. Her eyes were fixed upon it, either to read through its enclosures the characters within, or to avoid at that moment meeting the eye of her godmother. "I shall leave you, my love, to peruse it alone, and presently, when I think you have done so, will return to ask if you cannot in some degree comprehend what must have been felt at its not obtaining an answer." Having said this, Lady Harrington retired without waiting for a reply, and leaving Helen unable for a moment to learn what her heart throbbed with such violence to know. The letter of which Helen now held the copy has been already presented to the reader, and if she chanced to be one of Helen's age, having at her heart a love unbreathed to any human ear, She may guess what my Helen's feelings were at finding such love had met an equal, an acknowledged return. Such a one may guess Helen's feelings, but no other can. Lady Harrington's presently now seemed to Helen as much shorter than it really was, as the last had seemed longer. She had read the letter but 4 times through, and pressed it to her heart, kissed it, and so forth, not half so much as she desired, and it deserved, when a knock was heard at the door, and the old lady again entered. The happy but agitated girl stood up to receive her, and though she spoke not a single word, the manner in which she rushed into her maternal arms and hid her face upon her bosom spoke plainly enough that the gallant colonel had no reason to despair. "What must he have thought of me?" were Helen's first words. "And you, and Sir Gilbert! Such a letter! Dearest, dearest Lady Harrington, you could not really think I had ever received it?" "You have struck the right chord there, my Helen. We all deserve to have suffered 10,000 times more than we have done, for having for a moment believed it possible you should have received that letter and not invented some means to answer it, let the answer be what it might. And this answer? You have not yet told me what it is to be. I do not know how much or how little you may happen to like William, my dear, but in case you should have no insuperable aversion to him, the business is made delightfully easy by this adventure. The elopement is done and over already." Helen only pressed Lady Harrington's hand to her heart, but said nothing. "Yes, you have found the way to let me into your secret without speaking. This little heart throbs violently enough to prevent any suspicion of indifference. But what am I to say to my impatient hero below? That you will, or you won't marry him as soon as the lawyers will let you." "Oh, Lady Harrington!" "Come downstairs, my dear. You had better come down, I do assure you, for I expect Sir Gilbert will be up in a moment, and you cannot suppose that William will remain behind, and my bedroom would by no means be so dignified a scene for the denouement as the great saloon. Come, dear, come." And Helen went, trembling, blushing, with tears in her eyes, and such palpitation at her heart that she was very sure she could not pronounce a word. But what need was there of words? The happy colonel was soon perfectly satisfied, and thanked her on his bended knee for a consent more looked than spoken. Even Sir Gilbert himself, though singularly attached to plain speaking, seemed well content on the present occasion to dispense with it, and pressed Helen to his heart, and kissed her forehead, and called her his dear daughter, apparently with as much satisfaction as if she had declared herself ready to accept of his son in the very best arranged words ever spoken upon such an occasion. When the first few decisive moments were past, and each one of the party felt that all things were settled, or about to be settled, in exact conformity to their most inward and earnest desires, and when Helen was placed as the centre of the 6 loving and admiring eyes that were fixed upon her, she closed her own, but it was neither to faint nor to sleep, but to meditate for a moment with the more intensity upon the miraculous change wrought in her destiny within the last few hours. "What are you thinking of, my Helen?" said the colonel, jealous, as it should seem, of losing sight of those dear eyes even for a moment. "I am endeavouring to believe that it is all real," replied Helen with beautiful simplicity. "Bless you, my darling child!" said the rough baronet, greatly touched. "What an old villain I have been to you, Helen! Abusing you, hating you, calling you all manner of hard names, and your little heart as true as steel all the time." "Real? Real that you are beloved by me, Helen?" cried Colonel Harrington, absolutely forgetting that he was not tête à tête with his fair mistress. "And how is she to answer him, with you and me peering in her face, my lady? Ought we not to be ashamed of ourselves? Come along this moment." "Very well, I will go, but only upon one condition, Helen. Remember, William, she is to indulge in no disagreeable reminiscences and no melancholy anticipations, but look just as beautiful and as happy when I come back as she does now." This farewell advice was not thrown away, for it assisted Colonel Harrington to baffle or to banish all the fears and regrets respecting her mother's displeasure at her conduct, which came like a cloud across the bright perspective of Helen's hopes for the future. Her lover showed himself, indeed, sufficiently adroit, both in turning to account all the favourable circumstances attending their sudden engagement, and in using his mother's authority to prevent her dwelling upon what was unfavourable. "Might not a second home," he asked, "be of great advantage both to Fanny and Miss Torrington? Might not the connection tend to keep Mr. Cartwright in order, and prevent his finally injuring Charles? And lastly, did she not think it would give pleasure to that Charles himself?" To Lady Harrington, Helen had frankly recounted the history of Corbold's hateful persecution, from its first beginnings in London to the fearful outrage it had led to on that eventful day; but she had begged her to repeat no more of it to Sir Gilbert and the colonel than might be sufficient to render her running away intelligible; and this request having been strictly complied with, for Lady Harrington seemed as unwilling as Helen to trust her menfolk with this history, Colonel Harrington, in conversing with her on all she had felt and suffered since her mother's marriage, spoke of him only as a presumptuous man who had dared to persevere in addressing her after she had refused him. It was probably the heightened colour of Helen, as she listened to this mention of his name, that excited a greater degree of interest and curiosity concerning him than her lover had at first bestowed upon him. "Were those hateful addresses repeated by letter or in person, Helen?" said he, fixing his eyes upon her agitated face. "In person, in person," answered Helen impatiently. "Did your mother know, Helen, how greatly those addresses annoyed you?" "I have often attempted to tell her, but she has always evaded the subject, telling me strangely enough, and heaven knows not very correctly, that it was plain I did not know my own mind, or else that I was guilty of affectation." "Your mother, then, Helen, would have approved of this man's addresses?" "I fear so." "It was, then, to avoid her importunity that you left her house to day?" Helen looked uneasy and distressed under this questioning, but answered, "No, Colonel Harrington, not her importunity, but his own." The blood mounted to the young soldier's face, and an angry glance shot from his eye, as if he suspected something approaching, but at great distance, to the truth. "He surely did not dare to be impertinent? Helen, you have not told me all. You came here in a state of dreadful agitation. Tell me, I conjure you, all that has happened to you. You will not, Helen? What am I to think of this? That you have been insulted in a manner that you will not repeat to your affianced husband? For heaven's sake, put an end to this torture. I must know all." "Your mother does know all, Colonel Harrington. Make me not repeat the hateful history again." "Will you refer me to my mother? Will you permit me to tell her that you have done so?" "Why, Colonel Harrington," replied Helen, "should you wish to know more than I have told you? But of course I cannot object to your knowing all that has passed between us. Only I think he does not deserve the trouble you take in speaking of him." Much to the surprise of Sir Gilbert and his lady, who were very amiably undergoing a real penance by absenting themselves from the sight of happiness which touched them so nearly, Colonel Harrington was seen hurrying towards them, where they were beguiling the time as they could by inhaling the cool breath of evening under the cedar tree. "Take a turn with me, mother, will you?" said he in a voice not quite so gay as they expected to hear from him. Lady Harrington immediately rose, and passing her arm under his, they walked off together at a rapid pace to a distant walk. "Mother," he said, stopping short and looking earnestly in her face, "tell me, I beseech you, everything that you have learnt from Helen respecting that wretch Corbold. For some reason or other which I cannot understand, she is averse to entering upon the subject with me. But she assures me that you know everything that has passed, and she has authorized my asking you for the particulars." "Has she, William? Then she is a silly girl for her pains. But it is your fault, I dare say. You have been tormenting her with cross questions about a vulgar villain that neither of you ought ever again to call to remembrance. Say no more about him, or his precious cousin either. Surely we can find more agreeable subjects to talk about than the vicar and his cousin." "Very likely, mother, but I cannot be easy till I know exactly what it was which caused Helen to leave her mother's house in the manner she did this afternoon. Have I not a right to inquire? Can you blame me for doing so?" "No, my dear William, I do not. But heavily shall I blame you if you make an extorted confidence the source of quarrel between an officer of rank in his Majesty's service and a pettifogging Methodist attorney of Wrexhill." "Is it possible, mother, that you know me so little as to think there can exist the slightest chance of my doing this? Pray do not keep me in this fever for the sake of protecting me from a duel with Mr. Stephen Corbold." "There you are, hothead, your father's own son beyond all question. Now listen then to this infamous story, and take care that you do not renew a sorrow that is past by improperly resenting it." After this preface, Lady Harrington ventured to repeat to her son the narrative she had heard from Helen. He listened with very exemplary tranquillity, only occasionally biting his lips, but uttering no single word of any kind till it was concluded. He then said very quietly, "Let us return to poor Helen, mother. How admirably has she behaved throughout!" Lady Harrington looked up into her son's face as if to discover whether his calmness were genuine, but his pocket handkerchief at that moment concealed his features, and as he walked rapidly towards the house, she could only take it for granted that all was right, and follow him. Having reached the door of the room where he had left Helen, he opened it, but waited outside till his mother overtook him. "Go to her, mother," said he, "and confess that you have told me everything. I would rather you did this than me. Tell her, too, that she has behaved gloriously, and when I think you have put her at her ease about me, I will come to you." So saying, he passed on, and entered a small parlour that was called his own at the front of the house. Sir Gilbert soon followed his lady, and without going again over the disagreeable narrative at length, the whole business was made sufficiently intelligible to the baronet to make him extol in high terms the courage and presence of mind of his future daughter. This occupied a quarter of an hour excellently well, but still the colonel came not, and Helen, though with no feeling of alarm, certainly kept her eye upon the door with more steadiness than she was herself aware of. At length Lady Harrington began to show evident symptoms of that state of mind usually called fidgeting. She rang the bell, and asked if the colonel were at home. The servant did not know. Tea was ordered, and when it came, the same question was repeated, but the same answer was not given, for the man said that the colonel had been seen to go out about half an hour ago. "Who saw him go, John?" said her ladyship. "Did you?" "No, my lady, it was the colonel's own groom." "Send him here." The groom came, and was questioned as to how and when he had seen his master go out. "I was in the harness room, my lady, and the colonel came in and took down, one after another, all the coachmen's whips from the pegs, and at last, my lady, he chose the newest and the stoutest, and carried it away with him. But he said never a word," whistled Sir Gilbert, with very considerable continuity of sound. "That will do, Dick. You may go. And so his colonelship is gone forth with the stoutest and the best horsewhip he could find. Well, upon my word, I do not think he could have done better. Foolish boy!" exclaimed Lady Harrington. "He will get into some abominable scrape or other." "Yes, my lady, he will horsewhip the lawyer, you may depend upon it, and then he will have damages to pay. But for an only son, William is far from extravagant, and I really don't feel inclined to begrudge him this little amusement. Nor I either, Sir Gilbert, provided he takes care not to get into a downright vulgar brawl." "Come, Helen, come," said Sir Gilbert, turning towards her. "You must not look pale, my child, for this. You are not afraid that there will be any blunder, are you? And that the attorney will horsewhip the soldier? No harm will be done, depend upon it, except to my new horsewhip." End of chapter 11. Volume 3, Chapter 12 of the Vicar of Wrexhill. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The Vicar of Wrexhill by Francis Milton Trollope. Volume 3, Chapter 12. Mr. Corbold's Adventures. It was some time before Mr. Stephen Corbold recovered sufficiently from the effects of Helen's libation to enable him to see where he was, or to perceive that where he was she was not. The ceremony had, indeed, been a painful one, but it at least did him the good service of dispelling the effects of the wine he had taken, and after a few moments more of winking and blinking, and wiping his smarting eyes, he descended the stairs to seek his cousin, a soberer, if not a better man than when he mounted them. Everything was at this time in full activity on the lawn. Above 2,000 people were assembled there, all much more than decently clad, and presenting altogether a very striking spectacle. Those who before dinner had been the company were now converted into spectators, many of them accommodated with seats in the shade, from whence they watched the checkered movements of the motley crowd. This cool and quiet position was in every way beneficial to those who had been tempted to heat themselves by drinking somewhat too freely of the vicar's wine. Among these Mr. Corbold introduced himself, probably more sober than any of them, except perhaps the vicar himself, but bearing in his altered eye and general discomfiture of aspect more visible traces of intemperance than any individual amongst them. Mr. Cartwright rose to meet him with a sensation of considerable alarm. He fancied from his appearance that he was quite intoxicated, and feared the utterance of some folly which might explain the cause of his having absented himself more fully than was at all necessary. This idea was by no means lessened when his cousin beckoned him from the party amidst whom he sat, and gravely assured him that Miss Helen had very nearly murdered him. "Compose yourself, cousin Stephen, compose yourself. Where have you left her?" "Left her? She left me, I tell you, blind and almost suffocated. If you don't wish to have the whole county set gossiping about Mrs. Mowbray's will, your wife's will, I mean, you had better let me see that vixen properly punished, cousin. As I live and breathe, I will have revenge somehow." You shall, Stephen," answered the vicar, endeavouring to quiet him. "She shall be treated in any way that you like, only don't make a noise now." "Will you give orders that she shall be confined to her room and kept on bread and water?" "To be sure I will, if you desire it. She shall be locked up as soon as the place is cleared, and you shall see it done, Stephen, if you will only step in and take a nap in my library to recover yourself a little." This proposal was on the whole a very tempting one, for Mr. Stephen Corbold's head ached with considerable violence, not to mention that he had hardly yet recovered his eyesight, and was otherwise very ill at ease. So, without arguing the matter farther, he retreated to the comfortable station recommended to him, and soon fell into a slumber that lasted till the whole business of the day, prayers, blessing, and all, were done and over, and the place as solitary and forsaken, as if no serious fancy fair, no Israelitish missionary, and no Fababo had ever been heard of. It was then that the Vicar of Wrexhill remembered his cousin Stephen, and it was then that Fanny Mowbray, looking around the room in which the whole family was assembled, said, "Where is Helen?" This question, which as it seemed no one could answer, and the recollection of his library guest, coming at one and the same moment across him, made Mr. Cartwright start. Poor man! He was most heartily fatigued and worn out by the honours, glories, and hospitalities of the day, and wished for nothing on earth so much as soda water and a bedroom bogey; but he felt that his labours were not over, though not exactly aware how much remained to be done. Having furnished himself with a light, and commanded that Miss Mowbray should be desired to meet him in the library, he repaired immediately to that room, where he found, as he expected, his serious and legal relative as fast asleep in his favourite armchair as he himself wished to be in his bed. The ceremony of awakening him was soon performed, and when he once more stood on his feet, and had rubbed his still suffering eyes sufficiently to perceive where he was, the vicar addressed him thus, in the most gentle voice imaginable, hoping to soothe and get rid of him: "Well, cousin Stephen, you have had a nice nap, and now you'd better go home. It is getting quite late. Good night, Stephen." "What have you done with that murderous vixen, cousin Cartwright? I won't stir till I know you've locked her up as you promised to do." "I have ordered her to come here, Stephen, that you may yourself hear what I mean to say to her." "Oh, I don't want to see her, cousin Cartwright," replied the attorney, in a tone that betokened as much fear as dislike. "I only want to have her punished." "And punished she shall be, depend upon that. But if you really do not wish to see her, cousin Stephen, you had better be off at once, for I expect her here every moment. I will walk with you myself as far as the lodge." Whatever vengeance he wished executed on Helen, that he had no inclination to be present at it himself was proven by the alacrity with which the attorney acceded to this proposal. "Only let me get my hat. It's quite a new hat, and I'll come with you this moment, cousin Cartwright." The hat was found, and the two serious gentlemen set off together across the lawn. From that point, to within a few yards of the lodge, the lawyer entertained the minister with such an account of Helen's attack upon him as convinced the latter that it would be quite necessary, in his parental character, to exercise such a degree of authority as might speedily bring the rebellious young lady to reason. It was already as dark as a fine night in July ever is, and the fine large oaks which in many places overhung the road rendered some spots particularly sombre. At one of these, and just before they arrived at the park gates, they heard the steps of a man whom they appeared to be overtaking. "Who can this loiterer be?" said Mr. Cartwright. "My people had orders to see that the grounds were cleared and all the gates locked before this time." "We shall be able to see him when we get beyond those trees," replied Corbold. He was quite right. A few steps farther brought them to an open space, and there, as if waiting for them, stood the intruder, as still and silent as if he had been a statue. "We are 2 to 1, however," observed the attorney; "but he is a monstrous tall fellow." The next breath that issued from the lips of the vicar's cousin came not in words, but in a most dismal, hideous, and prolonged yell, for the tall fellow had seized him by the collar with one hand, while with the other he brandished and applied a huge horsewhip to his shoulders with such energy, activity, and perseverance, that his howling startled the dull ear of the night, as well as the frightened organs of his astonished kinsman. Though Mr. Cartwright had not the slightest intention of doing so unclerical a thing as interfering in the fray, he drew a little nearer to it than was quite prudent, from a natural curiosity to know who the bold mortal was who dared thus belabour his cousin. The light was sufficient to enable him to discern Colonel Harrington in the aggressor, but it should seem that it was not equally effective to the eyes of that gentleman himself, or he would hardly have ventured to permit a few apparently random but very sharp cuts to visit the reverend shoulders of the owner of the soil on which he stood. This prodigious impiety, however, certainly took place, upon which the vicar, very properly anxious to put the earliest possible stop to such indecent proceedings, ran off as fast as his legs could carry him, and in about half an hour returned again with 8 stout serving men, armed with bludgeons, broomsticks, and the great kitchen poker. That he had not, in his agitation, forgotten the spot on which he had left his unfortunate cousin, was quickly made manifest to the ears of all who accompanied him, for dismal groans made themselves heard exactly from the place where the operation had been performed, and on examination the bruised body of Mr. Stephen Corbold was found extended on the grass, apparently too stiff and sore to have much power of movement left. Even during the hurried interval which Mr. Cartwright spent in his house while waiting for the gathering together of his host, he had found time to inquire of his wife if she had seen Helen, and being told in reply that she was nowhere to be found, the extremely disagreeable truth immediately suggested itself to him. In one short, sharp moment, he remembered Colonel Harrington's suppressed letter, Corbold's permitted outrage, Helen's escape, and the degrading lash that had so vigorously saluted his own shoulders. How was it possible that being, as he most undoubtedly was, the lord and master of Cartwright Park, and all the wealth annexed thereto, and holding his lady's comprehensive will, signed, sealed, and duly executed, in his own possession, how could it be that he should feel so utterly beat down, overpowered, and degraded? The bitter pang, however, lasted but a moment. What was the gossip of an hour or a day when set against the solid happiness of wealth? This was still his, to have and to hold, and after one little pinch at his heart as he thought of the longed-for mitre, he struggled manfully to despise the paltry annoyance, and hastened, with all the speed he could make, to the rescue of his cousin, and, if Heaven so willed, to inflict vengeance, even unto death, upon his enemy. Heaven, however, did not so will. Colonel Harrington, having given the attorney exactly the quantum of flogging he intended, stuck his card, with his name and address, both in town and country, into the groaning man's pocket, laid him down very gently on the grass, and departed. The disposal of the flogged gentleman's person was now taken into consideration. Some cousins, perhaps, might have thought that a bed at Cartwright Park would have been the best thing to propose for it, but it appeared that such was not the opinion of Mr. Cartwright; for having quickly ascertained the situation of affairs, and assured himself that Colonel Harrington was no longer within his reach, he instantly ordered the coachman and stable boy, who were among his suite, to return with all possible haste to the house, and prepare a carriage instantly to take his ill-used cousin home. "Take me to your house, cousin," murmured the smarting man. "I shall die if you send me to Wrexhill." But Mr. Cartwright did not happen to hear him, and indeed his time and attention were wholly engrossed till the carriage arrived, and his kinsman lifted into it, by a strict examination of his people at the lodge, as to when Colonel Harrington had entered the park, and whether they were at all aware that he was still lurking there. To all which inquiries he of course received for an answer, "La, your honour! Upon such a day as this, how was anybody to mark who went in or who went out of the park?" Mr. Stephen Corbold was therefore safely conveyed to his own dwelling in Wrexhill, and the vicar returned to tell his lady, that from circumstances which had transpired, there could be no doubt that her daughter Helen had eloped with Colonel Harrington. On my word, my dearest Cartwright, I hardly know how to be sorry for it. William Harrington would be an excellent match for any woman. They were very fond of each other when they were children, and Helen has been so miserable and moping ever since I married, that it has been quite a misery to see her. I thought she was in love with your cousin. However, I suppose she has changed her mind again, and that it was a fit of jealousy on the part of Harrington that made him attack poor Mr. Corbold. But we can't help it, you know. I am tired to death, my dear Cartwright. Do not let us stay up any longer talking about it. I dare say Helen will be very happy." So ended the eventful day of the Fababo Fancy Fair. It is not necessary to inquire what were the reports, or what the gossipings, to which this day's events gave rise. The papers announced that a very large sum had been collected for the interesting missionary, and all the Hampshire world soon said that Colonel Harrington was going to be married to Miss Mowbray. But the attention of the Park family themselves was at this time greatly engrossed by Henrietta. She had long been in a very delicate state of health, but probably from some cold caught at the late fête, her symptoms had become rapidly more alarming. She was soon confined to her bed, and the most skilful physician in the county gave it as his opinion that she could not live many weeks. Rosalind was indefatigable in her attentions to her, and when the awful judgment of the physician was made known to her, she at once resolved that Henrietta should be made acquainted with it, in the hope that the prospect of approaching dissolution might soften her heart and lead her to seek and receive the only consolation of which such a situation admits. Rosalind was too truly attached to Helen not to rejoice at the unexpected step she had taken, though her surprise at it was unbounded. She knew Helen's character well. She knew, too, how implicitly they had trusted each other, and that this known, trusted, and trusting friend should have eloped without having even hinted to her that Colonel Harrington had confessed the love which in happier moments she owned she hoped he felt, was inconceivable. Still it was true, and though no line of explanation had ever been permitted to reach her, still she rejoiced, and with all the trusting confidence of her nature, believed that whatever appeared wrong or unkind would some day or other be explained. She now rejoiced yet more at Helen's absence. Henrietta had never admitted her even the uncertain and capricious degree of friendship which she had bestowed on herself, and had she been still at the Park, it would have been difficult for Rosalind to have devoted herself so wholly to the poor sufferer as she now did. Mrs. Cartwright's situation prevented her from being much in the room. Fanny was still less there. She and Henrietta had never loved each other. At first Fanny disliked her because it was easy to perceive that she was neither beloved nor approved by Mr. Cartwright, and Henrietta despised her in return for the easy weakness with which she had become her father's convert. So that, in this awful hour, Rosalind was the only friend who drew near her with affection, and most tender and constant was the care she bestowed upon her. To the communication which she had so much dreaded to make, though she considered it her duty to do it, Henrietta only replied by assuring her that for more than a year she had been fully aware that death was rapidly approaching her. "Alas! how lightly have I listened to you, dear Henrietta, when you have said this!" replied the weeping Rosalind. "But the reason, dear friend, why I could not believe you were in earnest was" "Speak fearlessly, dear Rosalind," "was that you thought I was unfit to die. But so are many, Rosalind, who yet must go when nature bids them. But now, Henrietta, oh, tell me that you do not still doubt all things, doubt even the being of the eternal power that made you. Tell me, I beseech you, that you have read and thought on these things since that dreadful day that I overheard you make the confession to Mr. Hetherington, which has rung in my ears ever since." "Yes, Rosalind, I have read, and I have thought. But not now only, my kind friend. My short life, Rosalind, has been but one series of perturbed thinking. My brain has been racked by it, but I have gained nothing. I have no power, Henrietta, no learning, no strength of reason to remove the doubts that so fearfully darken these your last hours. Yet what would I not give that you could taste the ineffable comfort of perfect hope and perfect faith?" "Perfect faith," replied Henrietta impatiently. "Why do you have recourse to the slang I hate? Teach me to hope. Oh that you could! But let me not hear the hateful words, the false use of which has been my destruction." "Henrietta, dearest Henrietta, will you consent to see a clergyman who can speak to you with the authority of age and wisdom?" "A clergyman!" she replied scoffingly. "Perhaps you will propose that I should see the Reverend Mr. Cartwright." "No, no, you do not think that it is such as him I would wish to send to you?" "Yet he is my father, Miss Torrington. And there it is, you see. There lies the difficulty. Name a clergyman, and Mr. Cartwright seems to rise before me. And shall I use my dying breath to say that I would hear with reverence what such as he could say? Leave me in peace, Rosalind. Let me sleep, I tell you. If there be a God, he will pity me." There was so much feverish excitement in her manner of speaking, that Rosalind, terrified lest she might hasten the hour she so earnestly wished to retard, in the hope that light might break upon that darkness which it was so terrible to witness, forbore to answer her, and tenderly arranging her pillows under her head, kissed her pale cheek, and set herself down behind the curtain, in the place that she now almost constantly occupied. After a moment, however, Henrietta spoke again, but it was gently and calmly. "Leave me, my most kind Rosalind," said she. "Leave me for an hour or two. You must want the fresh air, and I want perfect solitude. Rosalind, I will think. Let no one come to me till I ring my bell. Go, my dear friend." Rosalind, greatly affected by the changed voice and manner, pressed to her lips the emaciated hand held out to her, and retired. Rosalind did indeed require the refreshment of air and exercise, from which she had almost wholly debarred herself for above a week; and such refreshment will certainly do more towards restoring the exhausted strength, both to body and mind, than any other remedy which can be devised. Yet though it acts well, and almost infallibly on the system, the benefit does not at once reach the consciousness of the weary watcher. Rosalind, as she slowly dragged her languid steps along, felt none of the pleasurable effects of the sweet breeze that blew on her face, for she was not aware of it. Her heart and soul were still in the chamber of the dying Henrietta; and though greatly too well taught to believe that a few feverish moments of changed opinions can put the passing spirit into a state of fitness for heaven, still she clung to the hope of hearing the unhappy girl avow better thoughts and feelings than those which had so long brooded over her misguided spirit. Fully occupied with these meditations, Rosalind walked for an hour, almost mechanically, through the shrubberies, unmindful of the sweet voice of nature that greeted her in the songs of birds and in the breath of flowers, and thinking only of what she might say or do to make the light of truth send one cheering ray upon the last hours of her unhappy friend. When she re-entered the house, her maid, who was watching for her, said that Miss Cartwright had rung her bell, and requested to know when she returned. Blaming herself for her long absence, Rosalind hastened to the sick room, and found Henrietta seated upright in her bed, with rather more animation and brightness in her eyes than she wished to see, for she thought it betokened fever, but her voice and manner were gentle and composed. "Your words have not fallen to the ground, my most kind Rosalind," said she. And if it be possible, during the short period that remains for me to live, that I should attain a clearer knowledge of what I am than I have hitherto possessed, I shall welcome it most gladly. But of all the attributes with which the beautiful idea that you call God is invested, the only one that I conceive it possible for mortals to share with him is truth. Power, alas, we have none; of knowledge very little, of wisdom less; and as to perfect goodness, perfect benevolence, we are not framed to feel it. But truth, clear, pure, beautiful, and bright, we can know and we can feel. It can make a part of us, even as it makes a part of him. And by this only, as it seems to me, can we approach him, touch him, and as it were be part of him. For truth in a mortal, Rosalind, if it exist at all, is perfect as in a God. It is therefore, my dear friend, that though I feel, and have always felt, that there may be an existing cause endowed with will, productive of all the wonders of creation, and though this wondrous existence, if it be, deserves all worship, and though I, more sinned against than sinning, have offered none, yet I still feel that I may be forgiven. If I have kept far off from him my worship and my thoughts, at least I never have approached him with falsehood on my tongue or in my heart. And to my judgment, this is the only crime relating to our intercourse with God at which we need to tremble. If such a being be, can our blundering theories so touch his greatness that he should deign to frown upon us for them? No, no, no. We cannot know him, and those who guess the nearest can guess but very darkly. But truth and falsehood are as much within the compass of man's nature as of God's, and therefore are they, as concerning him, the only virtue and the only sin." Henrietta spoke these words with her eyes closed, slowly and deliberately, as if her mind, like a cloud that turns forth its silver lining to the night, sought in the midst of darkness to show the faint gleam within. But every word she uttered made Rosalind more deeply feel the necessity of letting her hear the truths of religion from some one who had made its laws the study of a holy life. She longed that she should hear with more authority than she could lend to it the voice of God himself, as revealed to man in records enduring as the world. But where was she to seek such a one? As poor Henrietta had said, the name of a minister could to her suggest no other image than that of her father, and from him she ever seemed to turn with horror. Yet still Rosalind could not endure to abandon hope that such a one might be found, and only waited till Henrietta would promise to see him before she took measures for the purpose. In answer to this request, the dying girl replied, "But my permission is not all that is necessary, dearest Rosalind. What would my father say if you were fortunate to obtain for me a visit from such a one as you describe? He would not bear it. He would not admit his approach. I know he would not." "Let me ask him, Henrietta." "No!" cried the invalid with sudden energy, as if she had at that moment conceived and decided on her line of conduct. "I will ask him myself. This doubt, this darkness, this fearful mist that seems to hang about me, is terrible. Why should I not feel hopeful and assured as you do? Send to him, Rosalind. Send to my father, and send too for his besotted wife, and for the poor, weak, wavering Fanny. Send for them all. But don't you leave me, Rosalind. I have a strange, anxious fluttering at my heart. It will be better when I have spoken to him." Rosalind delayed not a moment to do her bidding. There was an inequality in her manner that frightened her. She feared her time was short, and so worded the summons she sent to Mr. Cartwright and his wife, that they came instantly. Fanny entered the room nearly at the same moment, and it was evident from their manner that they all thought they were come to receive her last farewell. The feeble Henrietta asked Rosalind so to arrange her pillows that she might sit upright. Rosalind did so, and then kneeled down beside the bed. Mr. Cartwright stood with his back leaning against the bedpost, and his eyes fixed on the ground. His wife entered leaning on his arm, and had not quitted it; but for some reason or other, Henrietta, who rarely took notice of her in any way, now asked her to place herself in a chair beside her bed. "You had better sit," said she. "You are not very strong in any way." Fanny stood apart and alone, having looked round upon each of them. The dying girl fixed her eyes upon her father, and thus addressed him: "I have heard you say, 1,000 times perhaps, that religion was the business of your life; and for that reason, sir, its very name hath become abhorrent to me. Oh, father, you have much to answer for. I would have given my own right hand to believe in a good, a merciful, a forgiving God, and I turned my young eyes to you. You told me that few could be saved, and that it was not what I deemed innocence could save me. You told me, too, that I was in danger, but that you were safe. You told me that heaven had set its seal upon you, and then I watched you. Oh, how earnestly I spied out all your ways! I found fraud, pride, impurity, and falsehood mixed with your deeds through every day you lived. Yet still you said that heaven had set its seal upon you, that your immortal soul was safe, that happiness eternal was your predestined doom. I listened to you as a child listens to a father. Not a word was lost, no, nor an action either. And then it was, Father, that I became an unbeliever, an hardened infidel, a daring atheist. If it were true that God had chosen you, then it was true my soul rejected him. Yet Rosalind, dear Rosalind, do not hate me, do not shudder at my words. It was because I found no truth in him, that I could not, would not believe his doctrine true. But you, good, kind, and innocent, I believe you." The harsh and awful accents of her voice changed into a tone of the deepest tenderness as she continued to address Rosalind. "When did you ever lie? You told me there is a God, and I may trust you. You do not prate of grace, and then labour to corrupt the innocence that looks into your face to ask the way to heaven. You do not bid me wear a mask of feigned assurance of salvation, nor will you bind my hands, nor keep me from the light of day, when I refuse to kneel and sigh and play the hypocrite. You will not bid me lie, and tell me that so only can I find the way to heaven. You will not." With slow and stealthy pace, Mr. Cartwright at this moment began to creep from his station and approach the door. But Henrietta, whose eyes were half closed, for the lashes seemed heavy with tears, instantly opened them and cried aloud, "Stay! I have a right to bid you, father. This good girl is kind and innocent, but she is young and very ignorant. What can she know of heaven? Is there, speak truly, these are the last words you will ever utter to me, is there within our reach some pious, holy, humble man of God, such as I have read of, but no saint? No saint? Father, is there such a one? And may he come and pray with me?" Every eye in the room was fixed on Mr. Cartwright as his daughter made the appeal. For some moments he did not answer, but upon Henrietta's repeating loudly and almost wildly, "May he come?" he answered in a low, husky voice, "This is mere bravado. You have lived a scoffing infidel, and a scoffing infidel will you die. If indeed you wished for prayer and pardon, you would turn to me for it. My curate may pray with her, but none else." And with these words he turned away without looking at her, and quitted the room. The silence of death seemed already to have settled on the chamber, which was broken at length by the deep sobbings of the unfortunate Mrs. Cartwright. "Poor soul!" said Henrietta, turning towards her. "She is not wholly bad, but more unfit to judge and act than a baby, for they can do nothing, and she, alas! can do much dreadful mischief. With my dying breath, unhappy victim of a most finished hypocrite, I do conjure you not to wrong your children, to enrich him. Poor soul! He loves her not, no, not even so much as, silly as she is, she well deserves from him. He will have a child born to him here, and another at Gloucester, much at the same time. Do not ruin your poor helpless children for him." Mrs. Cartwright sat with her eyes unmovably fixed on those of Henrietta, even after she had ceased to speak. She sighed deeply, but uttered no syllable in reply. "Take her away, Rosalind. I have no more to say to her. And poor Fanny too. Heaven bless you, Fanny. You may go now, my dear. All go but Rosalind." Her commands were instantly obeyed, and once more the two strangely matched friends were left alone together. "It is too late now, my Rosalind. My strength is failing fast. I can hardly see your sweet kind eyes, dear Rosalind, but I can hear. Read to me, dearest, quick. Open the Bible that you left for me. Open it where the man says to Paul, 'Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian.'" Rosalind opened the precious volume, and read to her slowly and distinctly that exquisite passage of heaven-taught eloquence, which produced in reply the words she had quoted. Henrietta's eyes were closed, but now and then a gentle pressure of the hand she held in hers persuaded Rosalind that she heard and understood each powerful word of that majestic pleading. When she had reached and read the words Henrietta had quoted, she paused, and in a moment afterwards the now expiring girl uttered in broken accents, "Yes, stop there. It has reached my soul. From your lips only, Rosalind." Then suddenly her dying eyes opened, and fixed themselves on Rosalind. She clasped her hands as if in prayer, and then with a strong effort pronounced these words, "Lord, I believe. Help thou my unbelief." Her head sank on her breast. The breath that uttered these words was her last. End of chapter 12. Volume 3, Chapter 13 of The Vicar of Wrexhill. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The Vicar of Wrexhill, by Francis Milton Trollope. Volume 3, Chapter 13. A change comes o'er the spirit of her dream. Helen had been nearly 6 weeks at Oakley without receiving a single line or message from any individual at the Park. She had written to her mother, fully explaining the reasons which had led her so suddenly to absent herself, and also, in the most respectful and affectionate manner, announced to her the proposal of Colonel Harrington, and the approbation of his parents, adding her earnest entreaties that her mother would not withhold her consent to their marriage. To this letter she received no answer, a circumstance which would have occasioned her the most cruel uneasiness, had not the fate of Colonel Harrington's letter to herself enabled her to guess that of her own to her mother. To Fanny and to Rosalind she likewise wrote, and with the same ill success; but fortunately for her tranquillity, their silence was reasonably interpreted in the same manner, and though this could but ill console her for the separation existing between them, it at least prevented her from feeling the pang of neglected affection. From her brother she received the only letter that had reached her since they parted, and though it was written in a strain of very melancholy despondency respecting himself, it spoke of her prospects with an energy of satisfaction and hope that it was delightful to have inspired. The report of Henrietta's death reached her through the servants, and though no cordial intimacy had ever existed between them, she felt as a gentle-hearted young creature must ever feel on hearing that a companion of her own age and sex was gone hence to be seen no more. More than ever did she wish for tidings of her family, and of Rosalind perhaps more than of any other, for she knew that if her feelings for the poor Henrietta had not amounted to affection, she had inspired a very powerful interest in her bosom, and that Rosalind was likely to feel her early death very painfully. It was therefore with the strongest emotions of joy that one morning, rather more than a week after the event, she saw Rosalind approaching the principal entrance of the house, alone and on foot. Helen flew down the stairs, through the hall, and out upon the steps to meet her, opening her arms to receive her with all the eager warmth of welcome natural after such an absence. But before Rosalind returned the embrace, she exclaimed, "You have seen your mother, Helen?" "Alas, no!" replied Helen. "Would to heaven I had, Rosalind!" "What is it makes you think I have had this great happiness?" "Because I have just met her, just seen her with my own eyes driving down the avenue." "Impossible! Rosalind, you must be mistaken. I have been sitting in my own room these 2 hours, copying a long Act of Parliament for Sir Gilbert, and if any carriage had been here, I must have seen it." "No, no, you would not. I observed that the carriage drove direct from the stable yard, and out into the avenue below the second gate. When I saw the carriage, spite of my astonishment, my first feeling was terror lest I should be seen myself, and accordingly I retreated behind one of the enormous trees, which I am sure hid me effectually, but from whence I had not only a full view of the Cartwright equipage, but of Mrs. Cartwright in it, looking, I am sorry to say, even paler and more ill than usual." "Is my mother looking ill, Rosalind?" said Helen anxiously, and seeming for the moment to be unmindful of the strange circumstance of her having been at Oakley. "Is she unwell?" "I grieve to say that I think she is. A scene which took place in poor Henrietta's room only a few moments before she died, and at which Mrs. Cartwright was present, has, I think, shaken her severely. But what can have brought her here, Helen, unless it were her wish to see you? And yet she has been and is gone without your hearing of it." "It is indeed most strange," replied Helen, ringing the bell of the drawing room into which they had entered. "Lady Harrington is, I know, in her closet. Perhaps my mother has seen her." "Has my mother been here, Thomas?" inquired Helen of the old servant who answered the bell. "Oh dear no, Miss Mowbray, that was no ways likely." "Likely or not, Thomas, I assure you she has been here," said Miss Torrington, "for I myself met her coming away." "Then, if that is the case, young ladies, there is certainly no use in my telling any more lies about it, for that's a job I don't like to be put upon, seeing as I am not over and above used to it. And so, as you know it already, I'm quite ready and willing to tell you the truth. Mrs. Mowbray, I ask your pardon, ladies, but I really can't call her by no other name, Mrs. Mowbray has been shut up in the library for above 2 hours with my master." "How very strange!" exclaimed Rosalind thoughtfully. "Then I am sure she has chosen this day for the same reason that I did. Mr. Cartwright was sent for last night by the Earl of Harrowmore. Though he is not very communicative about his adventures in general, he could not resist mentioning this flattering circumstance at tea last night, adding that he could not refuse the excellent and pious old nobleman, who probably was desirous of obtaining the benefit of his advice on some business of importance. And this morning he set off in his travelling carriage and 4 post horses, with 2 outriders, leaving word, as Judy told me, that he should not return till to morrow." But, good heavens, what can Mrs. Cartwright have had to say to Sir Gilbert? And how in the world did he come to admit her, Thomas?" "Since you know so much, you might as well know all, ladies. The carriage, sure enough, did not venture to drive up even to the back door without leave asked of Sir Gilbert. At least I suppose it was to ask leave, that one of the new park servants brought a note for him first. I took it in myself to him, and said, as I was bid, that the man was to wait for an answer. Never did I see mortal face screw itself up funnier than Sir Gilbert's when he was reading that note. He looked for all the world as if he wanted to whistle. Howsomever, he did no such thing, but only scrawled a bit of an answer as grave as a judge. And then it was, Miss Mowbray, that he ordered me to say no word whatever of the park servant's coming, or of the carriage coming after, as it was likely to do, and he sealed up his answer, and told me to give it to the man, and then to go into the garden to look for you and the colonel, Miss Mowbray, and bid you to come in, as you know I did, miss. And after a bit you went upstairs, miss, and the colonel's horse was ordered, and when he was off and all clear, then, and not before, the carriage drove into the stable yard, and your poor mamma, Miss Mowbray, looking as white as a sheet, went tottering and trembling into Sir Gilbert, and there she stayed till about 10 minutes ago, when the bell rang and out she came, but looking, I thought, a deal less miserable." "Thank you, Thomas," said Helen. "This is, I believe, all we wish to know." The venerable serving man took the hint and departed. "What can all this mean, Rosalind?" said her friend, the moment the door closed behind him. "Has anything happened at home that can account for it?" "I hardly know how to answer you, my Helen, without appearing to know more than I really do. For in honest truth I know nothing. Your mother, it would be wrong to conceal it from you, Helen, is certainly very much out of health, and for some weeks past has appeared, I think, out of spirits and unhappy." "Oh, Rosalind, do you think it is I who have made her so? Do you think that my coming here has made her really unhappy?" "Indeed I do not. On the contrary, I am firmly persuaded she rejoices at it. You know, dearest, that since her marriage I have never been in great favour, and no wonder, considering the very particular aversion I have ever felt and perhaps manifested towards her bridegroom. But more than once, since you left us, she has spoken to me in a manner which reminded me of the days that are gone. And once she said, when that hateful cause of all harm, her Tartuffe husband, was not in the room, 'You must greatly miss poor Helen, my dear Rosalind.' I involuntarily caught her hand and kissed it, earnestly fixing my eyes on hers to discover, if possible, what she thought and felt about you. She guessed as much, I fancy, for she turned her head away from me, but she pressed my hand, and said, almost in a whisper, 'Dear Helen, I trust that the step she has taken will end in her happiness.' He entered just as she had uttered those words, and the manner in which she started and withdrew her hand, when the handle of the door turned, told me plainly enough that her love for her holy spouse was not of that perfect kind which casteth out fear. There was, moreover, Helen, a tear in her eye when she named you." "Oh, my dear, dear mother!" cried Helen, her own eyes overflowing with freshly awakened tenderness. "To hear this, Rosalind, is a joy far greater than I can express. And yet, if this returning love is obtained at the expense of her own happiness, I am a wretch to rejoice at it." "You would be a wretch to purchase it at that price, perhaps," replied Rosalind, "but not for rejoicing at it, now that, poor soul, she has already paid the penalty, as, in truth, I fear she has, of peace of mind for returning reason." "And what has occurred, Rosalind, to make you think her less happy than heretofore?" "It is not very easy to answer that question, Helen, excepting the death of poor Henrietta, and the awful scene which preceded it, in which she accused her father, in the presence of Mrs. Cartwright, Fanny, and myself, of pretty nearly all the sins and iniquities of which a man can be guilty. Excepting this, I can hardly say that any particular circumstance has occurred which can account for the evident change in your mother's spirits, which was quite as evident before the death of Henrietta as since." "You have observed no unkindness towards her on his part, Rosalind?" said Helen anxiously. "No, certainly I have witnessed nothing that could be called unkindness. You know, Helen, he can smile and smile, but he seems, I think, to watch her. More than once, when I have been going to her, I have met him coming away, and when he has seen me, he has turned back and re-entered her room with me. I know I have been savagely cross to her ever since her hateful marriage, but since I have seen her looking ill and miserable, my hard heart has softened towards her, and I have sought instead of avoiding her, and I am quite sure that from the moment he perceived this change, he has been on the qui vive to prevent our being alone together." "My poor dear mother! I fear that she may live to deplore this marriage as much as we have ever done. You know, Rosalind, that we never believed Mr. Cartwright to be the holy man he proclaimed himself. But since I have been here, I have heard dreadful stories of him. Lady Harrington's maid is a prodigious gossip, and though I really give her no encouragement, she never dresses me without telling me some new report respecting him. He has, however, a very strong party at Wrexhill, who appear firmly to believe that he is a perfect saint. But here, you know, They are literally and figuratively of another parish, and seem to make it a matter of duty to their own pastor to believe all the tales they can pick up about him. There is one very shocking story indeed that is, I think, quite incredible. They say that Mrs. Simpson has been seduced by him, and only went away to be confined. Incredible! No, this story is a commentary on one part of Henrietta's dying accusation. She said he would have a child born to him at Gloucester, nearly at the same time as that expected here. "And it is to Gloucester she is gone!" exclaimed Helen. "Gracious Heaven, what a wretch!" "That this at least is true, I have not the slightest doubt," rejoined Rosalind. "And what is more, I am certain that your mother has heard it. You know that this precious vicar invited Mrs. Simpson's child to pass the period of her absence at the Park. And you must remember how very fond of the poor little thing your mother seemed to be, actually listening to her parrot performances in the fanatical line as if she had been inspired. It was before you went, I think, that I laughed at her so immoderately for saying that she prayed for currant pudding every night, and that Mrs. Cartwright was so very angry with me about it. Well, observe the change, and account for it as you will. For the last 2 or 3 weeks she has hardly spoken to the child, or taken the least notice of her, and if I am not greatly mistaken, it is for about the same period that her health and her spirits have appeared to droop. Depend upon it, Helen, some one has carried this report to her." "It certainly seems probable. Poor, poor mamma! How terrible her feelings must be, Rosalind, if from thinking this man something half-way between heaven and earth, she has really found out that he is an hypocrite and a villain." "Terrible indeed! I would that she had not so well deserved it, Helen. But now comes the question, what has brought her here?" "I think I understand that perfectly," replied Helen. "No sooner are her eyes opened to the real character of this man than her tenderness for us returns. I have little doubt that she came here to speak of me. Perhaps, Rosalind, she has heard, and you too, of my engagement with Colonel Harrington?" "Perhaps we have, Helen," replied Rosalind, laughing; "and I think it is likely that you have partly read the riddle right, and that she may have taken advantage of her watchful husband's absence to express to Sir Gilbert her approbation, which, you know, is necessary before you can be married, Helen." "I know it is," replied Helen, colouring; "and if indeed she has given this consent, she has removed the only obstacle to our immediate marriage." "Then heartily I wish you joy, sweet friend," said Rosalind, kissing her. "Novice as I am, I found out long ago, did I not, Helen, that you and Colonel Harrington, or Colonel Harrington and you, I really do not know how to express myself to spare your beautiful blushes, my dear friend, but I am very, very glad of this. In every way it is so desirable. Poor dear little Fanny, whose hair is gently creeping down into ringlets again, will find a fitter home with you, Helen, than Cartwright Park can be for her." "How fast your fancy runs, Rosalind! How do we know that my mother's visit," and Helen's bright blushes all forsook her as she spoke, "how do we know that it was not to forbid this marriage that she came, and not to permit it? 2 months ago, had the same thing occurred, I should have thought so. Now I cannot think it. However, Helen, this suspense cannot last long. Although Sir Gilbert forbade his servant to mention your mother's visit, for fear perhaps that it should reach the ears of her husband, you may depend upon it that he will inform you of it himself. But I must go, dearest. I by no means wish this instance of positive rebellion to the commands of my guardian should be known. You must remember the command I long ago received not to carry on any correspondence with the family at Oakley, and this command has never been rescinded. So adieu, my dearest Helen. I am quite persuaded now that nothing which you could write would reach me at the Park. But unless I am positively locked up, we may surely contrive to meet without my again performing this desperate feat of disobedience. Could you not wander in the fields sometimes?" "I have done so constantly, dear Rosalind, but ever and always in vain." "That has not been because you were forgotten, but I have seldom left poor Henrietta, and never long enough to have reached the fields. But now I certainly can manage this. I should like to bring poor Fanny with me, but this I will not do for fear of drawing down the anger of Mr. Cartwright upon her, which she would not bear, I think, so well as I. But ought I not, before I go, to ask for Lady Harrington? Oh yes, I am sure she would be so very glad to see you." A message was accordingly sent to my lady's closet, and the 2 girls requested to go to her there. Helen was not without hope that she would mention to her Mrs. Cartwright's visit, but she was disappointed, nor was there the slightest reason to believe from her manner that she was acquainted with it. She appeared exceedingly pleased at seeing Miss Torrington, and told her that whenever she could venture to repeat the visit without endangering the tranquillity of her present irksome home, they should all be delighted to see her. It was, however, high time for her to depart, but while returning through the breakfast room in her way to the hall door, she met Sir Gilbert. The remembrance of her last interview with him, and its abortive result, brought sudden blushes to her cheeks. She remembered, too, that she had never offered any explanation to Sir Gilbert for so suddenly changing her mind, and altogether she felt so painfully embarrassed, that she hardly ventured to raise her eyes to his face. The voice in which he greeted her, however, soon chased every feeling of embarrassment, or anything that was not agreeable, for it spoke nothing but welcome and hilarity. "What, the bright-eyed Rosalind, come to look after the runaway! But I hope you have not scolded her, Miss Torrington, for leaving you all in the lurch. Upon my honour, young ladies, she was very right. Take my word for it, she never did a wiser thing in her life. But has she told you the scrape she has got into, Miss Torrington? Poor child! No sooner ran away from a snake of a stepfather than she has got noosed by a tiger of a father-in-law. Ask my lady else. Has she told you all about it, my dear?" "Perhaps not quite all, Sir Gilbert, but quite enough to make me very happy, and wish her joy, and you too, most heartily." "Thank you, my dear. I am very much obliged to you. I feel very much inclined to wish myself joy, I assure you, and my pretty daughter too. Kiss me, Helen. Bless you, my dear child, and Charles too. That's a fine fellow, Miss Torrington. And bless your pretty Fanny, especially as her soul, you say, has found its way out of limbo. It is a remarkably fine, pleasant day, Miss Torrington. Such a day as this always puts one in spirits." Rosalind turned to give a farewell embrace to her friend, whispering in her ear as she did so, "At least there has been no refusal of consent, Helen. Adieu." End of chapter 13. Volume 3, Chapter 14 of The Vicar of Wrexhill. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The Vicar of Wrexhill, by Francis Milton Trollope. Volume 3, Chapter 14, in which sundry visits are made. Whatever kind or remorseful feelings had led Mrs. Cartwright to make this unexpected visit to Oakley, she seemed to consider this one visit enough, for it was never repeated; and however tenderly she might watch over the fate of Helen, it was evident that she could only venture to do so secretly, for Sir Gilbert never mentioned her visit to any one. But knowing she had been there, Helen's heart was satisfied when Sir Gilbert, joining her hand and his son's together, said, "Make haste, children. Get your courting done without loss of time, or you may find yourselves married before it is finished, and so continue lovers after the knot is tied, a thing never heard of in civilized society. But very likely, nevertheless, to happen to my Helen's husband. Let her marry when she will," said Colonel Harrington. To her affianced husband Helen could have no secrets, and accordingly he had been made acquainted with all that she knew respecting her mother's most unexpected appearance at Oakley. He drew the same inference from his father's joyous manner after it that Rosalind had done; and when Sir Gilbert alluded to their marriage as an event which was speedily to take place, no doubt remained either on his mind or on that of the happy Helen, that Mrs. Cartwright, having learned from some source which her husband could not impede the proposal that had been made her, she had proved her maternal feelings not extinct, though they had seemed obscured, and ventured to make this secret visit for the purpose of formally giving her consent, and thereby removing the only obstacle to their marriage. Instructions were accordingly immediately given by Sir Gilbert in person, for he declared that he must see the lawyer himself, and everything relating to settlements was speedily put in train. The day after the baronet's return to Oakley, he sent to Miss Mowbray, requesting that she would meet him in the library, and having greeted her on her entrance with even more than usual affection, he said, "Do you think, my dear Helen, that you should have courage to make your mother a visit, even in the lion's den? Do you think you could have courage to spend half an hour at the park? I don't think it likely that Master Corbold has forgotten his horsewhipping as yet. So I own, I think you may venture." "I will go anywhere or do anything that you think I ought to do, Sir Gilbert; and to see my dear mother and poor Fanny once more would indeed be a pleasure to me. We have met Rosalind twice since you went to London, and she gives a very indifferent account of mamma's health." "Poor thing! You shall go immediately, my dear child, if you have no objection. I have ordered the carriage. William and I will go on it with you as far as the lodge, and there we will wait your return. If you delay it above an hour, we shall drive up to the house to inquire what has become of you; but you may return to us as much sooner as you like." The carriage drove to the door as he spoke, but Helen kept it not waiting long, and on returning from her room to the hall found Colonel Harrington waiting to hand her into it. The two gentlemen stepped in after her, and in a moment she found herself on her road to Cartwright Park, accompanied by Sir Gilbert and Colonel Harrington. The strangeness of this came upon her so forcibly that she exclaimed, almost unconsciously, "Is it possible?" "I don't wonder at your saying that, my dear," said Sir Gilbert. "It is very natural. But you see, Helen, that as your mother has testified no dislike to your approaching marriage, or taken any steps to oppose it, I feel that she may expect perhaps. In short, I think it is very right that you should call upon her, and to prove that,
Angry as I have been, I do not bear malice. You may give her this little note from me, Helen. But for your life, child, do not let that wretch, her husband, see her receive it. I believe in my soul he would be the death of her if he thought she could touch a bit of paper from me. But the truth is, Helen, I think she has suffered enough. And in short, my dear, I forgive her with all my heart, and I should like her to have this bit of a note from me, and to get a friendly word of answer in return, if I could. But for heaven's sake be careful, child." "Fear not, Sir Gilbert, that I should run any risk of bringing more misery upon her than I fear she has already. I will be very careful, and most thankful am I to be the bearer of a word of kindness to her from you." "Well, well, Helen, that's all right. Bygones are bygones. Here we are at the lodge. Look at your watch, my dear, and remember, if you do not return in an hour, we shall come and fetch you. I fear nothing, for the fellow knows you are under the protection of the Oakley horsewhips. Only it is as well to leave nothing to chance. If you cannot in any way escape the eyes of the villain, bring my note back again. There now, dear, get out. Good-bye." The colonel was already at the door to assist her, and whispered earnestly as he quitted her hand, "You will not stay the full hour, Helen, if you love me." With a step as light as Camilla's, Helen traversed the park, and with a heart throbbing with many feelings, wound her way through sundry well-known twistings and turnings that brought her to the same door by which she had quitted the house on the memorable day of the fancy fair. From what Rosalind had told her, she thought that if she could find her way unannounced to her mother's dressing room, it was probable she should find her alone, and thereby be enabled to perform her errand without danger. In the stable yard she saw one of the vicar's regenerated stable boys, but he did not appear to take much notice of her, and she succeeded in reaching her mother's dressing room without interruption. She had calculated rightly. Mrs. Cartwright was sitting, or rather lying, alone in her dressing room, for she was stretched upon a sofa, totally unemployed, and appearing so ill that Helen almost uttered a cry as she looked at her. At the sight of her daughter, Mrs. Cartwright started violently, and rising from her recumbent posture, threw her arms round her with even passionate fondness. But dear, inexpressibly dear as was this moment to Helen's heart, she did not forget her commission, and while her lips still rested on her mother's cheek, she drew Sir Gilbert's note from her pocket, and placed it in her hand. "Read it quick, dearest mother. I know not what it contains, but Sir Gilbert charged me to let no one see you read it." Mrs. Cartwright seemed not to require any stimulant to caution, for reading it rapidly, she tore it into atoms, and then, removing some of the fuel from the grate, which though not lighted was prepared for fire, she carefully placed the fragments on the rest, and covered them up so that no speck remained visible. While thus employed, she said to Helen almost in a whisper, "Thank Sir Gilbert. Tell him I am better, at least well enough to take an airing." Helen had reason to rejoice that she had lost no time in executing her commission, for scarcely had her mother in all haste resumed her place upon the sofa, when Mr. Cartwright entered. By some means or other her arrival had certainly been announced to him, for his countenance and manner expressed agitation, but not surprise. He looked keenly first at his wife and then at her, but they were prepared for it, and excepting that Mrs. Cartwright's pale cheek was slightly flushed, and Helen's brow contracted by an involuntary frown, they neither of them betrayed any symptom of agitation. The Vicar of Wrexhill uttered no word of salutation or of welcome to his unexpected guest, nor did Helen address him. He placed himself, without any pretext of occupation whatever, in a chair commanding a full view of his wife and her daughter, and folding his arms, fixed his eyes first on one and then on the other, with the most undisguised determination of watching them both. The first words spoken were by Helen. "May I be permitted to see my sister Fanny?" said she. She addressed herself to her mother, but received her answer from Mr. Cartwright. "Most assuredly no. You have stolen into my house by a back entrance, and by the same you may leave it. You are used to the mode, it will not puzzle you, and if I may venture to give my opinion on the subject, the sooner you again make use of this appropriate mode of retreat, the better." "I believe you are right, sir," replied Helen coldly, adding very judiciously, "the reception I have met with has not been such as to give me any inclination to repeat the visit. Good morning, ma'am." "Good morning, Mr. Cartwright." Mrs. Cartwright, inexpressibly relieved by this happy stroke of policy, stiffly bowed her head, and Helen retreated, very literally obeying the mandate of the imperious master of the mansion, and, returning by the way she came, soon rejoiced her friends by her unhoped-for reappearance before half the allotted time had expired. Helen most accurately reported every word and look, which seemed not only to satisfy, but perfectly to enchant Sir Gilbert. He laughed, rubbed his hands, made her repeat every word again, and literally chuckled with delight as she dwelt upon the fortunate rapidity with which she had seized the only available moment to do his bidding. On the following morning, Sir Gilbert, when asked by his lady what he was going to do with himself, replied that he thought he should ride over to Wrexhill. He did so,
and returned only in time to dress himself for dinner. The following day, and again the day after, the same question, answer, and result occurred, it being quietly remarked moreover by the rest of the party, that the particularly sweet temper which the worthy baronet had brought from London appeared day by day to be wearing away, and something of what his lady called his tiger mood taking its place. On the fourth morning, her ladyship's daily inquiry having received in very sullen accents the same reply, Colonel Harrington remarked upon it as soon as he was gone, adding that he had a great inclination to go over to Wrexhill in order to discover, if possible, how his honoured but mysterious father employed himself there. "I really shall be very much obliged to you, William, if you will find this out," said Lady Harrington. "It is the first time since we two became one that I have ever suspected him of having a secret, and the consequence is that I am like to die of curiosity. Thus encouraged, I shall be gone instantly. Take care of Helen, mother, till I come back." And with these words he departed, leaving the two ladies leisure and inclination to discuss at length the many singular caprices of which Sir Gilbert had been lately guilty. At about 4 o'clock, Colonel Harrington returned, but his report tended rather to thicken than to elucidate the mystery. He had, without being remarked himself, seen his father walking up and down the town, apparently in a state of the most perfect idleness, and then the Cartwright carriage drove by the shop in which he had fixed his look-out. Mr. and Mrs. Cartwright were both in it. It stopped at the next door, which was that of the haberdasher, and they entered the shop together. In about 10 minutes Mr. Cartwright came out, and he heard him say to his lady, as he supposed, "Get your business done as quickly as you can. I shall be back in 10 minutes." He then re-entered the carriage and drove off. The instant he was gone, Sir Gilbert came out of the post office, into which he had darted as the carriage passed, and entered the shop in which Mrs. Cartwright was left. The interview, if he had sought one with her, certainly did not last above 5 minutes, when he reappeared, followed by the master of the shop, making innumerable bows. Sir Gilbert cut his obsequious civilities short by heartily shaking hands with him, and then departed. "Where he went next," continued the colonel, "I know not; but not choosing to meet him, and feeling somehow or other perfectly persuaded that he had seen Mrs. Cartwright, and that this interview, short as it was, had been what he waited for, I got my horse and galloped home as fast as I could." Scarcely had he finished his narrative when Sir Gilbert arrived. He said not a word, however, to throw any light upon his own adventures, yet he was neither silent nor sad. Several weeks elapsed after this without bringing to Helen any tidings of her mother. Her appearance and manner during their short interview had indicated so much languor and ill health, that her anxiety respecting her became very acute, and daily did she haunt every spot where it was probable she should meet with Rosalind. But in vain. No Rosalind came, and nothing was left but to inquire through servants and tradespeople the news of the Park. Nothing, however, obtained in this way afforded her satisfaction, for not only did every report so obtained tend to confirm the idea that Mrs. Cartwright was an invalid, but notwithstanding they were on many points uncertain and contradictory, they all agreed in representing the conduct of Mr. Cartwright as being strangely altered, and giving ground of fear to those who loved or pitied his unfortunate wife, that he would every day become a harsher and more jealous tyrant to her, for that of late he appeared fearful of leaving her for an hour alone. Happy, therefore, as Helen's individual prospects appeared to be, a heavy weight and sad foreboding hung upon her spirits. Her brother's letters, too, though eloquent in affection, and in every expression of joy at her approaching marriage, spoke of himself in a tone of such hopeless despondency as dashed her happier destiny with bitterness. It was no slight augmentation of these sorrows that she felt herself in great measure obliged to conceal them. To Colonel Harrington, indeed, she ventured to confess that her anxious solicitude for those she loved tarnished her happiness; but this confidence brought with it more sorrow than comfort, for she perceived but too plainly that she had blighted his happiness while confessing the imperfection of her own. Lady Harrington, though all kindness and even tenderness to her, seemed almost cautiously to avoid every subject that led her to talk of her family; and as for Sir Gilbert, he appeared to be enjoying a state of spirits so enviable in their uniform cheerfulness, that to mention fear or sorrow to him would have been wanton cruelty. At length, from the butcher or the baker, or some other of those indispensable functionaries who know all things concerning those who live, move, and have their being, by means of their ministering ambulations, and who fail not to make all they know to circulate as freely as they do themselves, at length from some such, the news arrived at Oakley that Mrs. Cartwright had presented her husband with a son, and moreover that the mother and child were as well as could be expected. To Helen this intelligence brought the most unfeigned joy. She believed that all her fears for her mother's health had been unfounded, and that, though it seemed certain she must live banished from her recovered love, she might at least enjoy the comfort of believing that she was well and happy. On Sir Gilbert the intelligence produced a very different effect. As Helen regained her spirits, he lost his; and though he was still gentle and kind to her, he was upon the whole as cross, crusty, and disagreeable as it is easy to imagine. One morning, while Colonel Harrington and Helen were sauntering in the avenue, he enjoying her improved cheerfulness, and she secretly blaming herself for having ever suffered him to pine for the want of it, they perceived a servant in the Cartwright livery galloping towards the house. The same idea, the same terror, though felt in a most unequal degree, struck them both. Helen turned deadly pale, and so persuaded did she feel that her mother was dead, that when they stopped the man and received from him a verbal notice that her mother was very ill and wished to see her, the words, though alarming enough in themselves, seemed to be a relief. They returned with all haste to the house to order the carriage for her; and while she was preparing for this sad and most unexpected expedition, the colonel questioned the servant, and learned from him that Mrs. Cartwright's infant having died in convulsions in her arms, she had fallen into a state considered by her attendants as extremely dangerous; that during the whole of the last night she had remained nearly insensible, but having recovered her intellects and speech, her entreaties to see Helen were so urgent, that Mr. Cartwright, who, as the man said, never left her bedside for an instant, consented that she should be sent for. Miss Fanny and Miss Torrington were also with her, he added, and young Mowbray had been written to, but he believed from what the people about her said, that there was little chance of her surviving till he arrived. Having learned these particulars, the colonel sought his father, not only to communicate them, but to ask his opinion as to the propriety of his accompanying Helen on this sad visit. "I cannot bear," he added, "that she should go alone." "Of course, young sir, you cannot," replied Sir Gilbert, with a sudden, and as his son thought, not very feeling return of cheerfulness. "I should as soon think of letting her walk thither on all fours. But your lovership must excuse me if I declare that it is my intention to accompany the young lady myself. I am sorry for you, William, but so it must be. There's the carriage. Go to my lady's closet, and let her hear the news." So saying, the baronet, without waiting to receive any answer, hastened to the door, and reached it just as Helen was stepping into the carriage. Without consulting her on the subject, he stepped in after her, and they drove away. It would be doing an injustice to the essentially kind feelings of Sir Gilbert not to avow that his manner expressed very tender sympathy with Helen's natural and heavy sorrow; but the minds of both were full, and few words passed between them during their drive. The lodge gates were standing wide open, and they dashed through them without seeing any one of whom the trembling Helen could make inquiry. But once arrived at the house, all suspense was soon over. Mrs. Cartwright had breathed her last about 10 minutes before they got there. Poor Helen's first burst of grief was terrible. The remembrance of her poor mother's last embrace, though it became the most soothing comfort to her during her after life, seemed at that moment only to soften her heart to greater suffering. Passive, and almost unconscious, she suffered Sir Gilbert to lift her out of the carriage and lay her on a sofa in the drawing room; and there, her tears flowing fast, and her very soul, as it seemed, melting within her, she might probably have long given way to her absorbing grief, had not surprise acted on her faculties more powerfully than salts or hartshorn, and forced her to open her eyes and her ears to witness the scene that passed before her. Having seen her placed on a sofa with a female servant standing by her, Sir Gilbert turned his attention from Helen, and politely requested permission to wait on Mr. Cartwright. Many, many things of an ordinary nature might have passed around her without rousing Helen from her deep and most true sorrow; but this request, and still more the tone in which it was spoken, awakened all her attention to what followed. The servant to whom Sir Gilbert addressed himself executed his commission promptly and effectually, for almost immediately after closing the drawing room door, he threw it open again, and his master entered. Mr. Cartwright walked into the room with a proud and lofty aspect, and a something both of sternness and of triumph on his brow, which Helen thought Sir Gilbert would not easily endure. But to her extreme surprise, the baronet accosted him with a degree of almost servile civility, bowing low, and uttering a few words of respectful condolence with as much deference and ceremony as if addressing a sovereign prince on the loss of his consort. Mr. Cartwright replied with equal decorum, but the glance of pride and triumph, not quite unmixed with something that gleamed like malice too, shot from his eye, and Helen shuddered as she looked at him. "I presume you are aware, Mr. Cartwright," said Sir Gilbert with imperturbable suavity, "that your late lady's eldest daughter, Miss Mowbray, is about to contract a marriage with my son. Her remaining, therefore, a member of my family will certainly be very agreeable to us all. But at this painful moment it would doubtless be a consolation to the sisters, as well as to their friend Miss Torrington,
could they be together? Will you therefore permit me, sir, to convey the three young ladies to my house together, there to await the opening of the late Mrs. Cartwright's will?" "For this young lady, sir," replied the Vicar of Wrexhill, pointing to Helen, "as she has chosen to exchange the protection of her own mother for that of your son, I have nothing to say, excepting perhaps that the sooner she leaves my house, the better satisfied I shall feel myself. But for Miss Torrington and Miss Fanny Mowbray, I must think further of it before I resign them to any one." "Well, sir," replied Sir Gilbert, with, if possible, still increasing urbanity, "we must in this and all things submit ourselves wholly to your will and pleasure. But may I, in testimony of my respect to the memory of a lady towards whom perhaps I have behaved with some harshness, may I hope, Mr. Cartwright, that you will permit me to attend her funeral?" "Of this too I must think further," replied Mr. Cartwright with much haughtiness. "And her son," rejoined the humble baronet, "I trust he will be present at the last sad ceremony?" "It is probable I may permit him to be so," replied the vicar, drawing himself up into an attitude that might really have been called majestic. "But permit me to observe, Sir Gilbert Harrington, such is, I think, your name, that I require not, in the arrangement of my affairs, counsel or advice from any man, and least of all from you." So saying, he turned on his heel and stalked out of the room. "Come, my poor Helen," said the repulsed baronet with great gentleness, and not in the least, as it seemed, resenting the insolence with which he had been treated. "Come, I would have wished to have taken your poor little sister and your friend Rosalind home with us, but Heaven's will, and the vicar's, must be done." End of chapter 14. Volume 3, Chapter 15 of the Vicar of Wrexhill. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The Vicar of Wrexhill by Francis Milton Trollope. Volume 3, Chapter 15. Mrs. Cartwright's Last Will and Testament. It was probably the love of seeing an enemy mortified, which, it may be feared, is too common to all men, which induced the Vicar of Wrexhill, notwithstanding the deep aversion he felt for Sir Gilbert Harrington, to suffer him not only to be invited to attend Mrs. Cartwright's funeral, but also to be present at the opening of her will. To both invitations the baronet returned a gracious acceptance, and accordingly once more found himself at the Park on the day that its gates were again to open to the funeral array of its owner. Charles Mowbray, as Sir Gilbert's carriage drew up, stood ready on the steps of the mansion to receive him, and tears moistened the eyes of both as they silently shook hands and entered the drawing room, where the funeral guests were assembled. The room was full. Not only all such saintly scions of the new birth as their esprit de corps always brought together were present there, but as many of the neighbouring gentry as he could collect were now assembled to witness the proud fanatic's crowning triumph. One circumstance only tended to damp the happiness of this full success, this great conclusion to all his hopes and wishes. His son was not present at it, and indeed so great had been the licence granted him, that he was at this time wandering, his proud father knew not where. Nothing, however, notwithstanding his deep-felt happiness, could be better got up than Mr. Cartwright's sorrow, as he watched his wife laid in the tomb. Never was white cambric used with better grace. Poor Charles the while sheltered himself behind the stalwart figure of Sir Gilbert, and wept unseen. Nearly the whole of the company who attended the funeral were invited to be present at the ceremony of opening of the will, which it was the pleasure of the bereaved widower should follow immediately after it. Again the large drawing room was surrounded by a circle of sable guests, not one of whom but felt more than usual curiosity at the opening a will upon which hung so large a property, and concerning which there were such conflicting interests. Sir Gilbert considerately led his friend Charles into a corner where he was not conspicuous, and placed himself beside him, both of them being in good part concealed by the tall and portly person of a gentleman whom young Mowbray had never seen before, and whom indeed several persons, not too much interested in the scene to note what passed, had observed to enter with the funeral train after its return from the church, although he had not been present at the interment. It is probable, however, that the master of the house himself was not aware of this, for he took no notice of him, and was in fact too fully occupied by the business afoot to know more or to think more of those around him, than that they were there to witness the proudest and happiest moment of his life. All the company being seated, and mute attentive silence hovering over all, Mr. Corbold, after bowing to 2 or 3 distinguished personages, whose seats were placed near the table at which he had stationed himself, as if to assure their attentive witnessing of the act he was about to perform,
broke open the seals of the parchment he held in his hand, and having spread it fairly open upon the table, read its contents aloud with a clear voice. Never man had a more attentive auditory. No sound or movement interrupted the lecture, and when it was concluded, a murmur only, of rather shamefaced congratulation from the particular friends of Mr. Cartwright, broke the continued silence. Something, meanwhile, very like a groan, burst from the breast of the unhappy Mowbray, but Sir Gilbert Harrington hemmed so stoutly at the same moment that no one heard it. The company had already risen from their seats, and some were crowding round the meek and tranquil looking vicar. Nay, one active carrier of evil tidings had slipped out of the room to inform Miss Torrington and Fanny of the nature of the departed lady's testament, when the tall gentleman who sat before the disinherited son arose, and with great politeness requested the attention of the company for one moment before they separated, for the purpose of hearing a document which he should be happy to have the pleasure of reading to them, and which, if not of so extraordinary a nature as the one they had just listened to, and therefore less likely to excite general attention, was at least of later date. Every one appeared to listen to this address with interest, and nearly the whole company immediately reseated themselves. Some keen-eyed persons fancied they perceived the Vicar of Wrexhill change colour, but they were probably mistaken, for when Mr. Corbold whispered to him, "In the name of heaven, what does this mean, cousin? You never left her, did you?" he replied, also in a whisper, but in a steady voice, "Never for time enough to draw a codicil? It is impossible." And having so spoken, he too reseated himself in the attitude of a listener. The tall gentleman then drew forth from his pocket another parchment, purporting to be the last will of the same lady, containing even more skins than the first, and running over with technical volubility a preamble, only important as describing the testator's state of mind. He proceeded to the more essential portion of the document, and then read slowly and loudly, so that all men might hear, the bequest of all she died possessed of to her beloved son Charles Mowbray, the only deductions being legacies of £50,000 to each of her younger children, and her jewels to her daughter Helen, provided that within 1 year from the date of the will she should marry, or have married, Colonel William Harrington of His Majesty's Dragoons. The name of Cartwright appeared not in any shape, probably because the provision for her younger children would have included the infant yet unborn when this will was made, had it survived her. This document was as fully and satisfactorily signed, sealed, witnessed, and delivered as the former one, the only difference being that it was dated some months later. The pen that has traced these events is too feeble to portray the state into which this change of scenery and decorations threw the Vicar of Wrexhill. It would have been a great mercy for him if he had altogether lost his senses, but no symptom of this sort appeared, beyond a short paroxysm, during which he called upon Heaven to witness his promise of going to law with Mr. Mowbray for the purpose of setting aside his mother's will. After the buzz produced by this second letter had subsided, Sir Gilbert Harrington arose and addressed the company with equal good taste and good feeling. A few minutes' conversation with his young friend Mr. Mowbray, he said, authorized him to assure the Vicar of Wrexhill that whatever private property he could lay claim to, a wag here whispered, sermons, surpluses, and the like, should be packed up and sent to the vicarage, or any other place he would name, with the utmost attention and care. He added very succinctly, and without a single syllable unnecessarily irritating, that circumstances connected with the situation of the ladies of the family rendered it necessary that the reverend gentleman should not continue in the house, a necessity which, it might be hoped, would be the less inconvenient from the circumstance of his former residence being so near. While his old friend was uttering this extremely judicious harangue, Charles escaped by a side door from the room, and bounding up the stairs to Rosalind's dressing room, where, though as yet he had hardly spoken to her, he pretty well knew she was sitting with his sister Fanny, he burst open the door, rushed in, and fell upon his knees before her, clasping her most daringly in his arms, and almost devouring her hands with kisses. Fanny stood perfectly aghast at this scene. During the few days that Charles had been at home, she had truly grieved to see the decided coldness and estrangement that was between Rosalind and him, and what could have produced this sudden change she was totally unable to guess. Not one of the family party had entertained the slightest doubt that the will, which Mr. Cartwright had more than once alluded to, was such as to render his late wife's children wholly dependent upon him, and this painful expectation had been already fully confirmed. But even if it had proved otherwise, Fanny knew no reason why this should so change the conduct of Charles towards Miss Torrington. Not so, however, the young lady herself. The vehement caresses of Mowbray explained the whole matter to her as fully and as clearly as the will itself could have done. And if she did bend forward her head till her dark tresses almost covered his, and if under that thick veil she impressed a wild and rapid kiss of joy upon his forehead, most people would forgive her, if they knew how well she had all the while guessed at his misery, and how often her young heart had ached to think of it. This impropriety, however, such as it was really the only one committed on the occasion. Sir Gilbert was an excellent man of business, as was likewise the tall gentleman his attorney. So seals were put upon all plate chests, jewel cases, and the like, except such as were proved satisfactorily by Mr. Stephen Corbold to have been purchased since the marriage of the widow Mowbray and Mr. Cartwright. All such were given over to the packing cases of the serious attorney and the serious butler, and at 9:30 p.m. the Vicar of Wrexhill stepped into his recently purchased, but not paid for, travelling carriage, and turned his back on the Park, once more Mowbray Park, for ever. But little remains to be said that may not easily be guessed at by the accomplished novel reader, and for such, of course, these pages are prepared. Little Mary Richards speedily became Lady Hilton, and Fanny Mowbray, during a visit of some months at her Scotch castle, learned to think of her religious sufferings with sufficient composure to enable her once more to look forward, as well as around her, with hope and enjoyment. And who is there that can doubt that the lovely Fanny Mowbray, with recovered senses and £50,000, even though she did for ever abandon her poetic pursuits, met, at no very advanced age, with a husband worthy of her? The too tall Miss Richards ceased to be serious as soon as it became decidedly mauvais ton at Wrexhill to be so, and in process of time they too married, leaving their charming little mother leisure to cultivate the friendship of Rosalind, who retained her partiality for her, and enjoyed her friendship and society for many happy years. Need it be said that Rosalind and Helen were married on the same day? So it was, however, and Mr. Edward Wallace performed the ceremony, the Vicar of Wrexhill being indisposed. Indeed, the air of the vicarage evidently disagreed with him; but, by the influence of some of the most distinguished of his party, both in religion and politics, he soon obtained an exchange with a gentleman who held preferment in the fens. He did not, however, obtain a mitre, though a great many serious people declared that he deserved it. A disappointment which was perhaps the more cutting from the circumstance of Mr. Jacob's having joined a troop of strolling players, and as he was not sufficiently successful amongst them to add any glory thereby to the family name, the loss of episcopal honours was the more severely felt. Everything else, I think, went just as it ought to do. Poor Miss Mimima was sent off to her mamma, who never again ventured to show her face at Wrexhill, probably fearing that she might cease to be considered as the principal personage of the village. Mr. Mowbray speedily re-established Mr. Marsh in his school. The old lawyer and apothecary returned, the newly hired serious servants retreated before the returning honest ones, and in short, a whole flight of fanaticals followed their incomparable vicar, till the pretty village of Wrexhill once more became happy and gay, and the memory of their serious epidemic rendered its inhabitants the most orderly, peaceable, and orthodox population in the whole country. End of Chapter 15. End of the Vicar of Wrexhill.